Despite the ocean being all around us, despite the ocean surrounding us, despite the ocean giving life to everything that we know and we love, sometimes it could feel like the ocean is out of sight and out of our minds. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are joining us from, good morning, good evening, good night, and welcome to the Caribbean Regional BBNJ Conference. The ocean is a vast network of water. It gives life to all of us, and it's so important for every nation on earth, particularly small island developing states, or just for the next few hours, we will rename it to large ocean states, because essentially that is what they are. However, today would give us a really good opportunity to have both a timely and vital conversation on the ocean, one that speaks directly to the health of our oceans, the protection of our shared biodiversity, and our collective responsibility as nations, not only to sign this treaty, but to carry out the responsibilities of this treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ryan Beju. I'm a journalist from Trinidad and Tobago, and I've had the utmost pleasure of knowing Lenica and her team at the High Seas Alliance for the last year. And it is absolutely my pleasure to be in Trinidad and Tobago and to be your moderator for this afternoon's proceedings. It is afternoon here in the Eastern Caribbean. It promises to be a riveting discussion. It promises to be a very important discussion. It promises to be an afternoon where we can take away a lot from this conversation surrounding the ocean, and particularly the High Seas Treaty, which we are seeking to ratify. However, when it comes to our oceans, we face unprecedented challenges, unprecedented pressures, particularly when it comes to things like overfishing, things like polluting our ocean. And of course, there is the ever-increasing challenges when it comes to climate change and the warming of our seas. Over the next 3 hours, we will be touching on all of those challenges. And we will also be looking at a lot of the solutions and how this BBNJ, how this conference, and how the High Seas Treaty can all help us getting towards a more healthy ocean that we can all live around, that we can all live in, and we can all live by. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our first speaker this afternoon, who will give us some host remarks, and that would be Rebecca Hubbard, who is a director at the High Seas Alliance. Rebecca, it's good to have you this afternoon.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me. And good morning. I'm actually based in Hobart in Australia. So it's very early down here, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'd just like to say, first of all, to thank our partners for joining us in hosting this webinar, and especially to Lenica Scott, the High Seas Caribbean Regional Coordinator, who has been brilliant in pulling this event together. And to everyone for attending. It's really fantastic to see such an amazing turnout and so much interest in the High Seas Treaty. So I'm not going to speak extensively because you've got some amazing speakers today, but I want to focus on why the High Seas Treaty matters for everyone around the world, really. It really gives us the opportunity to change our relationship with the ocean. For the first time, we will have the ability to comprehensively and transparently protect its wealth of life and improve access for all people to its resources and their benefits. The High Seas Alliance is an alliance of over 60 member groups, NGOs, and the IUCN from around the world. And our vision is for equitable conservation of the high seas. And that's why it's really important that we have people from all regions around the world engaged. The treaty will only be as effective as it is widely adopted. So we've been working with people in Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, the Pacific, and we're extremely pleased to be working with you all in the Caribbean. We welcome you to join High Seas Alliance in this exciting mission to protect the high seas, the half of the planet covered by the high seas. We welcome you to join us as a member. If you're an NGO, please become one of our very active member groups in the Alliance, or to send a message to your political leaders using our new online action. Join us in sending your message of support to your local governments, your national governments, to ratify the treaty as soon as possible and start to prepare for implementation and protection of the high seas. We all know that, particularly those of us who live on islands, that there are no boundaries in the ocean. What happens in our coastal waters flows out to the high seas, and what happens out there comes right back to us. So what happens in the high seas is affecting us all, and that's why we really urgently need the High Seas Treaty. And I know other people will talk in more depth about that. But I really look forward to working with you all, and I wish you well for the rest of the webinar. I'll be staying with you, so I really look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Really appreciate your kind words. And also, it's such an important point that you make. You know, most of us who live on small islands, particularly here in the Caribbean and out in the Pacific, whatever happens on those high seas affects us directly. We don't have big buildings and big infrastructure to protect us. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Rebecca. We really appreciate it. I see that in the chat, no introductions were necessary. Everybody's introducing themselves, saying where they're from. Absolutely loving it. Thank you all very much. Please continue to do so. Make virtual friends, exchange email addresses and phone numbers, exchange where you're working. We're all here to help each other. And as Rebecca pointed out, we can all join the High Seas Alliance as NGOs, as members, and be actively involved in the good health of our nation, of our ocean nation, I should rather say. Now, moving right along, I'd like to welcome now to give us her address, Susana Barrera Valderrama, who works with the SPAW, that's Especially Protected Areas and Wildlife. And Susana has been serving as the Marine Biodiversity Program Officer at the UN Environment Program Convention Secretariat since June 2023. And in this role, she coordinates the implementation of the Protocol on Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife, that's the SPAW that I was speaking about, throughout the wider Caribbean region. She's a Cuban national, and Ms. Valderrama brings over 20 years of experience in national and regional initiatives focused on the conservation and monitoring of marine species and ecosystems and the design and implementation of marine protected areas. A virtual welcome, Susana. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. It is a pleasure to be here today. And first, I would like to begin by conveying the apologies of Mr. Christopher Corbin, the coordinator of the Cartagena Convention Secretariat, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. However, I'm honored to speak on behalf of him and the UNEP Cartagena Convention Secretariat. The Cartagena Convention and its protocols, particularly the Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife Protocol, in which I have the pleasure to work, play an essential role in supporting global agreements aimed at the conservation of marine biodiversity and the sustainable management of the marine ecosystems. The objectives of the Cartagena Convention align with these key global frameworks, and in particular with the BBNJ agreement, the agreement to protect the marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. As this agreement shares the goal of conserving and sustainable use in marine biodiversity. The SPO protocol specifically provides a framework for protecting marine and coastal ecosystems in the wider Caribbean region, and its work directly contributes to the broader objectives of the BBNJ agreement, such as protecting marine biodiversity and promoting ecosystem-based approaches to governance. So these common grounds between all these between these agreements offer a unique opportunity for synergy and for the Caribbean to take a proactive role in global marine conservation efforts. So I would also like to take a moment to recognize the leadership of the High Seas Alliance and sincerely thank you and thanks and welcome this partnership that allows us to support the contracting parties of the Cartagena Convention, the countries in the wider Caribbean region, in their path to ratification and implementation of the BBNJ agreement and, of course, the Cartagena Convention and its protocols. The expertise and commitment of the High Seas Alliance colleagues are invaluable as we work together and to advance the conservation efforts and the sustainable management of marine resources in our wider Caribbean region. And of course, we look forward to furthering this collaboration. And finally, I would like to highlight some of the support available to countries through the United Nations Environment Program and the Cartagena Convention Secretariat with the financing of the Global Environmental Facility. UNEP provides various resources, including technical and financial assistance, to help countries in fulfill their obligations under the convention and its protocols, but to also advance in the ratification and of course the further implementation of the BBNJ agreement. So we are committed to supporting our countries in their effort to address marine biodiversity challenges, whether through capacity building, access to scientific data, or of course facilitating regional cooperation. So the UNEP Cartagena Convention Secretariat remains ready to assist in promoting dialogue, identifying solutions, and sharing best practices. So thank you again for being here today, and we look forward to continuing our work together for the benefit of the oceans and all of the people who depend on them. Thank you, and I wish you a fruitful session.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Really appreciate your words, and please convey our message of gratitude as well to Mr. Corbin, who could not be here, but we really did appreciate you backing him up. So many different countries in our chat. It is so heartwarming that we have over 150 participants at the BBNJ conference that's happening right now. Welcome wherever you are watching us from. We are so glad that you can join us. I'm seeing Barbados, I'm seeing Mexico, I'm seeing Sweden, I'm seeing Jamaica, I'm seeing Georgetown in Guyana. Welcome to everyone to the Caribbean Regional BBNJ conference. Moving right along, I'd like to welcome next our High Seas Youth Ambassador from EarthEcho International to address us, and they will be one from Brazil, who will be Sonia Violente Petasnik, and also AJ Sawant from India. Ladies and gentlemen, a virtual welcome to both Sonia and AJ.
Hello everyone, my name is Achay and I'm an ocean climate communicator and also one of the youth ambassadors for High Seas Alliance. And we'll be highlighting the role of youth-driven action to advance the High Seas Treaty, especially towards fast-tracking it, and what work we did throughout the last year in pushing forward this High Seas Treaty in our nations. Can you take the next slide, please? So I was the High Seas Youth Ambassador for India, and over the last year, we hosted several programs throughout the nation to make sure that we create youth engagement, create more buzz around what the treaty is, what high seas are in general, and also how youth can be a part of this larger policy movement, which is focused towards protecting one of the most important resources. We took part in the 10th World Water Forum in Bali, where we presented the brochure and inaugurated our program at Alcoy, India, where we had almost 1.5-hour-long session presenting nitty-gritty about the treaty among 70+ youth environmental activists as well as leaders, so that they could themselves again push it forward in their own communities. Besides that, we had several other programs that we presented, including the UN Faith Council webinars, schools, where we reached nearly 1,200 people, and also hosted our Youth Pledge Board, which got over 1,200 signatories. We also launched our first digital petition, which was High Seas Digital Petition for India, and also pushed the High Seas Treaty fast-track ratification as one of the recommendations from youth within the regional policy decision makers as well as the national decision makers. Besides all of this, we had a huge success, especially in pushing it in terms of media, where we almost secured 250,000 impressions and a lot of commentary, as well as people noticing what work young people were doing to push High Seas Treaty and why it was so crucial. Our plan for 2025 in India, particularly, is to have publications with Greenpeace India and the Nature Conservancy, and also having more youth-led movements which can push the High Seas Treaty and create more buzz around it in general public. I'll pass it on to my colleague Sonia, who will take it on from here.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia Valente Pitasnik. I represent Brazil as a High Seas Youth Ambassador, and here are some of the campaigns I've worked in the last year. First, I delivered some lectures for 5 different Amazon communities, youth groups, universities, and kids, telling them about the High Seas and the High Seas Treaty and why it's so important in their daily lives. I also launched a petition, a cultural art contest, plus social media posts about the High Seas and the High Seas Treaty. I launched and organized an artistic mural that since September got over 200,000 viewers. I authored different blogs and participated in several webinars, and I was a speaker at a side event at the CBD COP16 in Cali, Colombia. Our next steps are focusing primarily at the COP30 that's going to happen in November in Brazil. I'm also working with the Greenpeace Brazil, and I will continue advocating for the BBNJ, hopefully not only in Brazil, but in the whole world. We would also like to introduce you to the Gen Z platform, a global community of young ocean advocates from 13 to 25 years old, united for networking, learning, and collective action to protect and restore our ocean planet. Please, next. At the Gen Z, you can connect and collaborate with more than 2,000 members from 100 different countries, and you can learn and build different skills and connect with different cultures. And to participate with us, we can join us at joingenc.org.
We also have a very exciting news. Heist Alliance, in partnership with the UNEP, has come up with this amazing essay writing competition for ages 13 to 17 and 18 to 25 in these 2 categories, especially focused to the Caribbean region and Caribbean youth, so that we can empower them to be a part of the larger policy change movement. That said, all the details will be available on High Seas Alliance website, as well as the other websites which are associated with our program. Next slide, please. And we have Youth Ambassador for the upcoming year from Caribbean region, which we are really excited to announce on February 3rd. So watch out for it. Thank you.
Wow, February 3rd, a big announcement is coming. So everyone look out for both Ajay as well as Sonia. They will be having some big news come February 3rd. Thank you very much, Ajay. Thank you very much, Sonia, for such wonderful presentations. But everything that we do when it comes to climate change, when it comes to this High Seas Treaty, it really is for the future of our planet. And to see these youth ambassadors and the work that they've just presented, that they have done over the last few months into the last year, has been incredible. And they've really taken it in a very different direction than, let's just say, some of the older folks would have done. I look at Sonia's presentation, and her presentation had murals, using poetry, using the arts, really. She wasn't just speaking at COP16. She wasn't just doing petitions like the old school and traditional forms. These young people in Ajay and Sonia and all of the young people who are connected with the High Seas Treaty, they've been doing such incredible work with using their youth, using the technology, using the digital age to really push this treaty. Ajay, Sonia, congratulations on all the incredible work that you guys have done. And we really look forward to not only February 3rd and that huge announcement that you guys have coming for us, but also what comes in the next year, in the not too distant future. Congratulations once again, and so happy that you guys were able to carve out some time to present to us what you guys have been doing for the last few months into the last year. Thank you very much once again. Next on, we would like to move on and welcome and invite Ambassador Jerry Eno, who is a special envoy for oceans in the government of Grenada, to address us. It's going to be a very important message, so I implore everyone to pay attention to what Mr. Eno has to say. He's representing the government of Grenada as a special envoy for oceans. Mr. Eno.
Thank you and good afternoon to everyone. Are you seeing my slides clearly?
Seeing it really clearly, Mr. Eno. Thank you very much.
All right. I think I have a technical difficulty.
We saw it and now we're not seeing it.
Okay.
So you may have to just share your screen again.
You want me to share for you, Mr. Jerry?
Camilla can actually help you with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, you can go ahead and share for me.
Okay.
Thank you, Camilla.
No worries.
All right, perfect. So, my name is Jerry Eno. I'm the Ambassador Special Envoy for the government of Grenada with responsibility for oceans. Next slide. From the political and government standpoint, this treaty is very important for us because a significant portion of the Caribbean's economy relies on the ocean. For tourism, a lot of our economies are centered around tourism, fisheries, and agriculture. Now, fisheries and coastal tourism plays an important part of our economy. So the High Seas Treaty is most important to us to ensure that we protect our future. And as the previous, as the moderator indicated, that the future is in the youth. And if we don't leave and prepare something for the youth, we'll end up with a problem. Now, I just wanted to highlight for us here that the tragedy of the commons that Garrett Hardin spoke about, which is very important. The high seas is basically a free fall at the moment. And if we don't have any structures, policies, and any way to enforce and manage these resources, we would end up with the exact tragedy of the commons. So what we need is a strategic and a coordinated approach to the management of the high seas. Next slide. Now, I wanted to bring this slide here for particular importance. Now, what we see in here is a 4-year, every 4 years from 2022 backwards 4 years. So the picture on your top right-hand corner, it's the first year. And what we're looking at here is the density and the intensity of the distant water fleets. These are fleets that are not native to the Caribbean region, because I'm speaking about the Caribbean region here. So what we're looking at here is fleets that are coming all the way from Northern Europe, from Asia, and fishing for our high seas species, our highly migratory species, our straddling stocks, and so on. So what you're seeing here is that within a 12-year span, it has intensified, and it is almost bordering some of the Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean states, EEZ. Again, this has been 4 years old, so I would imagine that it's a lot more than what we are seeing. So and this is just the data from one particular country. Now, if we're looking at that, this visual alone is enough to sell that we need to ratify, that nations in the Caribbean, countries in the Caribbean need to ratify this treaty, because we need to manage these stocks. Now, this is only a 12-year progression of the fishing fleet in that region. Next slide. Now, for us in Grenada, we have one of the most vibrant tuna longline fishing industry in the Southern Caribbean. So for us, it is important that we sign and ratify the treaty, in which I'm working on currently. One of the things that we are doing right now is to take an ocean approach to the management of and the development of our economy. We are in the process of establishing a new Ministry of Blue Economy and Marine Affairs, which will be announced next month. which will focus on marine spatial planning, sustainable fisheries, ocean energy, and so on. So what we are trying to do is bring economic growth from the ocean, not just harvesting, but using offshore renewables like wind, tidal, thermal, conversion energy projects into our energy mix so that we solve some of our economic challenges with the ocean. We are looking at aquaculture, which is it's more or less non-existent in the Southern Caribbean. So it is, again, things that we are pushing towards. Next slide. Now, we would have signed the treaty last December. We are in the process of doing our local stakeholder consultations. The consultations is inter-ministry and the general public working with the stakeholder groups and so on. And by virtue of Grenada belonging to OECS and CARICOM, we are advocating for all of the other Caribbean and Caribbean states to join on and sign and ratify the treaty, because it is not just a document. The treaty should not be a document that nations sign just to have it ticked off on their books. But protection of the high seas is vitally important for us. So it is important that we sign and we find ways to enforce and work in a collaborative, engaging way with our neighbors, our international partners, to ensure that this treaty is come into force as soon as possible. Next slide. Now, we are already facing the challenges on the high seas. So again, highlighting the importance. Now, within the Caribbean, our fish stocks are being plundered. We have a lot of illegal and unreported fishing happening in the Caribbean. Our porous borders with limited maritime security domain awareness. It is important that we not only ratify, but through our international partners and through the support and the voice and the advocacy of the youths and so on, it is important that we highlight the needs, because the treaty is as good as the enforcement that comes with it. Now, if you don't have the military or the Navy or the Coast Guard capabilities to monitor and to enforce what is set out in the treaty and what is agreed in the treaty, it would be defeating the purpose. So advocacy not only goes for conservation, but also for governments and nations to invest in maritime security and maritime domain awareness. And we're facing that challenge. I wouldn't go into much details, but it is a dire state of the maritime domain awareness in the Southern Caribbean. Next slide. Now, the way forward, the way I see it, is that we work with our international partners, our regional entities, the OECS, the CARICOM. We have the CARICOM and we have our national ocean policies. We have the CARICOM Secretariat is working with all of the nations, the member countries, to have an ocean policy. And it is my hope that the ocean policy takes into account the BBNJ Treaty. In addition to the CARICOM, we have sub-regional bodies like OECS, which has an OECS ocean policy and ocean governance program happening. And the view is that these policies and governing instruments be inclusive and be the BBNJ Treaty be inclusive and be considered very highly within those documents, so that the governance part of it, the enforcement part of it is one holistic approach, because it is one ocean that we're working with. So we need funding, we need training, we need an enhanced capacity and capacity building and so on, to ensure that what we're working on, all of the workshops and training, the education, the public awareness does not go to waste, so to speak. So I think this is my last slide. If I double check, yes. So thank you.
Mr. Eno, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. And I just want to very quickly really press home something very critical that you said, because sometimes nations can sign a treaty and not really enforce what that treaty is about that they've signed on to. some really excellent points, and thank you very much for making the time to speak with us this afternoon. Truly appreciate it. Moving right along, I want to welcome, thank you very much, Mr. Eno. I want to welcome now Khalil Hassan Ali, who's from the IMA in Trinidad and Tobago. That's the Institute of Marine Affairs. And he will give us an overview of ocean governance frameworks and opportunities within the BBNJ at the regional level. Khalil?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. And good afternoon, everyone. Let me just start sharing my screen. Hope everyone can see my screen now. Good afternoon,
not yet,
everyone.
Khalil.
Not yet.
I'm sorry to cut you, Khalil, but not as yet.
Not as yet.
Yeah.
Would you like me to share them for you?
Yeah, I think that might be best.
That's okay. 1 second.
Camilla to the rescue again. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilla.
Is that okay?
Thanks very much, Camilla.
Yeah.
And thanks for the introduction, Ryan. And good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And first, let me thank the High Seas Alliance and the implementing partners for this conference for inviting me to be part of this BBNJ conference. My name is Khalil Hassan Ali, a researcher from the Institute of Marine Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. And today I have the opportunity and the pleasure to give a brief presentation on ocean governance frameworks within the Caribbean region. The opportunities and challenges that exist and how one particular organization within the ocean governance landscape has been engaged in the BBNJ process thus far and continues to be engaged. Next slide, please. This, of course, is a map of the wider Caribbean region, which is found in the West Central Atlantic Ocean. The Caribbean region is one of the most geopolitically diverse and complex ocean areas in the world. And the culturally diverse countries and territories that border this maritime area range from among the largest, example, USA, to amongst the smallest, example, Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, etc. And from the most developed to the least developed in the world. Both the marine resources as well as the key problems affecting these resources, for example, overfishing, pollution, habitat degradation, climate change, are shared and to a very large extent and by the many territories that make up this region. Highly variable progress exists across the region with regard to ocean management, including as it relates to biodiversity governance and capacities for marine resource management. And these may vary considerably at national, sub-regional, and regional levels. Since the focus of this event is the BBNJ agreement, it would be remiss of me not to flag on this map the 3 small pockets of areas beyond national jurisdiction within the Caribbean Sea. The rest of areas beyond national jurisdiction in close proximity to our Caribbean countries extends eastward into the Atlantic Ocean. Next slide, please. So the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, Agenda 21, established an internationally agreed action plan for sustainable development into the 21st century. And this Agenda 21 plan called for an integrated and multi-sectoral approach to marine issues at the regional level. This call for regional integration in ocean management endures today and is not just to address transboundary issues and the conservation and sustainable use of shared marine resources, but also it's for technical cooperation and sharing of costs among developing countries. Examples of efforts that have this coordinated, integrated, and multi-sectoral approach can now be found worldwide with really diverse approaches that cater to specific regional priorities, actors, geographical scales, environmental conditions, and really other peculiarities. And there we really see 5 core types of regional ocean governance initiatives, which are popular globally. And these are, firstly, regional seas conventions and action plans. Secondly, large marine ecosystems, or LMEs. Thirdly, regional fisheries bodies. Fourthly, leader-driven initiatives. And fifthly, political and economic communities that engage in regional ocean governance. For example, giving examples with the Caribbean, UNEP's Regional Seas Program, their regional mechanism for conservation of the marine and coastal environment. They really seek to implement region-specific activities, bringing together stakeholders, including governments, scientific communities, civil societies, local communities, and indigenous peoples. And the Cartagena Convention is the regional legal agreement for protecting the Caribbean Sea under UNEP's Regional Seas Program. Then moving on, we have the large marine ecosystem approaches. The world's ocean has been divided into 66 LMEs, or large marine ecosystems, with 3 existing in this region. The Caribbean large marine ecosystem, the North Brazil shelf, and the Gulf of Mexico large marine ecosystem. In the Caribbean over the last 15 years, through the Caribbean large marine ecosystem and the CLME Plus projects and the Pro-Caribe initiatives, which have encompassed the Caribbean large marine ecosystem and the North Brazil shelf large marine ecosystem, really a suite of projects establishing and implementing a 2015 to 2025 10-year strategic action plan for sustainable management of shared living marine resources in the region has been taking place. And notably, these initiatives are allowing for adoption of a regional ocean governance framework and a regional coordination mechanism for oceans in the region. Moving on to regional fisheries bodies, the Western Central Atlantic Fisheries Commission, or WACFC, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, or CRFM, and the Central American Fisheries and Aquaculture Organization, or SPESCA, and also the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, are fisheries management bodies whose geographical area of operation and material scope really include parts or all of the Caribbean Sea. With regard to leader-driven initiatives, one example is the Caribbean Challenge Initiative. It describes itself as a coalition of governments, companies, and partners working together to accelerate action on the marine and coastal environment. And these leader-driven initiatives are often driven by philanthropic organizations, but sometimes it also gets high-level political support, which can make them very important in the ocean governance landscape. And then lastly, we have political and economic communities that have interests, influence, and which undertake ocean governance in the region, including through the Association for Caribbean States, or ACS, the Central American Integration System, or CICA, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS, and the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM. And many of these initiatives and organizations would be very familiar to those of us who are engaged in ocean activities in the Caribbean. But it gives an idea of the complexity within the Caribbean region itself. Next slide, please. So one study that was done back in 2019 by Robin Mahon really found 21 different arrangements operating at the regional level within the Caribbean, which had a role to play in at least one aspect of ocean governance. So really, it's quite a crowded landscape, or rather a crowded seascape. These arrangements can vary widely in terms of actors involved, in terms of scope, where they range from sectorally focused on, for example, fisheries or environment, so overarching across all ocean sectors. And they also vary widely in terms of form, ranging from formal binding treaties to informal voluntary arrangements. Nonetheless, they can be found really coexisting in a polycentric governance system where there are multiple governing authorities or nodes operating at different scales, as opposed to one monolithic and one monocentric unit. So the figure on the right kind of gives a simplified idea of what the ocean governance landscape is like, with several different arrangements operating at different governance levels and scales interacting with each other. And the system may appear to be complex, chaotic, and fragmented, but it may have several advantages over centralized systems, and really in reality may be more ordered than it initially appears. Polycentricity provides for multiple mechanisms to enable mutual monitoring, learning, and adaptation of better strategies over time, and may also facilitate what we call subsidiarity, in which problems can be addressed at the most relevant and capable scale. The challenge that really exists is to try to encourage coordination and cooperation amongst all these arrangements to really avoid overlapping mandates and duplication of efforts. With regard to BBNJ, some of the arrangements have been operating in the BBNJ space more actively than others. Next slide, please. So I'll now go on to touch on how one of these arrangements in the ocean governance landscape really contributed to efforts in negotiating the BBNJ agreement. CARICOM, or the Caribbean Community, as a political and economic community, really organized and engaged in the BBNJ negotiations in order to try to attain beneficial outcomes for the region. Member states of CARICOM decided to participate as a bloc in the BBNJ negotiations, with the CARICOM Secretariat providing support to really coordinate efforts across the region. Next slide, please. So CARICOM countries, as we know, are small island developing states, with oceans being crucial for economic, social, and cultural well-being. However, although the ocean is so important, CARICOM as a whole has not fully worked towards or crafted a regional vision and policy on the oceans and how the sustainable ocean economy is to be developed. As Ambassador Eno mentioned earlier, this is now in the works within CARICOM. So hopefully we get that sort of policy soon. But the current situation can be contrasted, for example, with the EU, which has the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which really provides the EU and its member states guidance and directs resources as needed in the EU's trust in ocean-related development. In CARICOM, up to this point, developing and implementing such an ocean policy had been sidelined by competing priorities. It's not that CARICOM did not realize the importance of it, it's just that resources are limited. But thankfully, we are now finding resources to direct towards developing this ocean policy. And developing an ocean policy would catalyze the creation of further ocean governance architecture, including mechanisms and fora to engage with the general public and stakeholders. In the case of the BBNJ agreement, such engagement would have been useful to raise awareness and also to find out from stakeholders what they really needed and would have liked to see out of the agreement. And this information could have been used to help craft CARICOM's negotiating positions in order to try to maximize potential beneficial outcomes from the BBNJ agreement. Because CARICOM did not have such architecture set up for stakeholder engagement, the CARICOM group had to settle for really ad hoc and not as robust stakeholder engagement to help guide negotiating position development for the BBNJ agreement negotiations. We did have a one-off region-wide stakeholder engagement exercise, which was held in late 2020. But if we're being honest, it really was no substitute for regular long-term and ongoing, arrangement to engage stakeholders. Nonetheless, CARICOM Secretariat really did yeoman's service in helping to facilitate these important supporting activities, which contributed to enhancing CARICOM member states' approach to BBNJ agreement negotiations. Next slide, please. Of course, in highly technical negotiations, such as the BBNJ negotiations, beyond engaging with the general public and ocean stakeholders, it was also crucial that we engage with experts in the field. And within CARICOM, in-region expertise on ocean-related matters, of course, does exist within universities and regional and national organizations. That being said, when compared to the global north, there are considerably less expertise existing, especially as it relates to practical experience in actually conducting activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And also in some specialist fields that were important topics under the negotiations, such as marine genetic resources research. Also, when compared to other more developed parts of the world, the number of experts are limited, and we often find ocean experts in the region holding very important and demanding positions with extremely heavy workloads. This had implications for how much time they could dedicate to contributing and helping the CARICOM member states in the BBNJ negotiations. So in the negotiations, the CARICOM group found that there was a need for capacity building workshops for our ocean experts to firstly build their knowledge and capacity with respect to issues and peculiarities involved in areas beyond national jurisdiction and the BBNJ negotiations. Secondly, to provide these ocean experts with dedicated time to focus on BBNJ matters. Thirdly, the CARICOM group found that there was a need to build relationships with the negotiators and also to discuss priorities and negotiating strategy. And over the course of the BBNJ process, these capacity building workshops, 6 of them were held, 2 or 3 days each, and they were funded by international civil society donors. Of course, the focus of these workshops evolved as the negotiations progressed, but essentially these workshops brought the experts and New York-based negotiators together so that they could work on developing CARICOM positions. And these workshops were also very important team-building exercises. And out of them, really, a fantastic regional team of experts was established who had direct formal and informal communication channels with negotiators in order for them to provide technical advice when needed during the BBNJ negotiations. Next slide, please. When it came to presence in the actual negotiating sessions in New York, there was a telling difference in the size of delegations between the developing and developed states participating in the negotiations. Developed countries have far more resources to direct to the negotiations, and one of the reflections of this is in the size of delegations, which oftentimes for the developed countries contain UN-based negotiators who focus solely on BBNJ or even single BBNJ issues, and multiple capital-based experts on different aspects under negotiations. This contrasted, of course, with developing countries, for example, CARICOM countries. CARICOM countries are resource-strapped and have small permanent missions at the UN. Staff at these permanent missions cover multiple processes and committees apart from BBNJ and have very intense workloads. And really, without the pooling of resources by CARICOM countries, it would have been impossible for us to adequately and effectively cover the BBNJ negotiations. It was a struggle even with the pooling of resources, but division of labor within the CARICOM group, which allowed different countries to lead on various issues, really greatly helped CARICOM remain a very relevant actor in the negotiations. It is also important to note that negotiators based at the permanent missions of CARICOM states in New York may not necessarily be subject matter experts on law of the sea or ocean biodiversity matters. And This, along with the fact that the format for negotiations in the BBNJ process evolved over time to being parallel sessions where, for example, negotiations on environmental impact assessment were taking place in one room, and at the same time, negotiations on marine genetic resources were taking place in another. It really meant that there was a need for increased man and woman power to be physically present in New York during the negotiations, including the regionally based subject matter experts. The costs associated with getting capital-based experts in New York and having them stay for the 2-week negotiating periods were especially prohibitive for developing countries. But CARICOM member states, through coalescing as a team and coordinating through the Secretariat, were better able to access funds to get capital-based experts across to New York to participate in the negotiations so that we could have a really strong presence in the negotiating rooms and therefore advocate for the region's interests. Next slide, please. So just wrapping up, CARICOM member states really actively participated in the BBNJ negotiations, but naturally our participation was influenced by some of the existing global inequalities. As small island developing states, CARICOM countries have fewer resources available to work with when compared to developed countries, be they financial or human resources. And this influenced the levels of stakeholder engagement, the breadth of and depth of expertise we had available to us, and also the size of delegations which participated in the negotiations, all of which could have had implications on how much CARICOM states may have impacted the negotiation of the BBNJ agreement. Now, that being said, even with fewer resources, CARICOM member states managed to be important, influential, and respected actors in the negotiations. And member states, on the back of high-level political support through its Council of Foreign Ministers, really got a united approach to the negotiations, coordinated through the CARICOM Secretariat. And this led to, among other things, efficient pooling of resources and dividing of workloads, the effective use of regional expertise, and organized accessing of much needed assistance from civil society and the international donor community to really execute the plans that we wanted to execute with regard to the BBNJ agreement negotiations. CARICOM member states therefore managed to be relevant in the negotiations and advocate for our interests. And CARICOM's negotiating team was very satisfied with what was achieved, and also satisfied that most, if not all, of our key asks are now reflected in some way in the BBNJ agreement text. Going forward, coordinating engagement continues as member states go through the process of signing and ratifying the agreement. And as the BBNJ process advances through the preparatory commission and beyond, for example, when the first COP is established and that gets underway, CARICOM member states are continuing having a coordinated approach to the BBNJ agreement, which, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of everyone who was involved in the negotiations, only bodes well for how we engage at an international level with regard to these very important ocean issues that affect us quite intimately at our national level. Thank you very much. With that, I'll draw to a close and look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Really appreciate your presentation. And if it's one thing that you can get out of Khalil's excellent presentation, not only the challenges that CARICOM faces and the resource constraints, but also if we don't come together as a community, no single island will be able to stand up to the negotiators and the resources that some of these large nations have. Khalil, thank you very much. I agree with Juliet in the chat. That was a really excellent presentation. I want to welcome now to our virtual conference. And if you are now joining us here at the Caribbean Regional BBNJ Conference, we're just into the first hour. You've missed a lot, but you can catch the repeat. It will be recorded and presented elsewhere. But welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Please leave your name, where you're from, what you do in the chat, make virtual friends, make connections that you can keep with you after this conference. I want to welcome now to the floor Professor David Berry, who is a professor of international law and regional integration law at the University of the West Indies' Cave Hill campus. Professor Berry will be talking to us about the process of ratifying and implementing the BBNJ Treaty at the national level. Professor Berry, it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Warm greetings to everyone. A hard act to follow Khalil, who of course is masterful in his presentation. I will try to share my slides. I hope you can see them.
Yes, okay. We can.
I'm the only successful one. What a great luxury. What I'm going to talk about is two things. First, ratification, but that's fairly easy, and then the harder process of implementing it. So let me take you through my slides. So first, just an overview. We haven't really talked much about the agreement, and that will come a bit later, but this is a slide showing the status of it. So in the Caribbean, we have a number of states who've signed it, and three of the 15 who have ratified it are from our region. So what I would submit is that we have a widespread participation in the agreement, which is very much welcome. And hopefully more of the states that have signed it will move on to ratify it. What does ratifying involve? Ratification depends upon your national legal system. Each national legal system will have a different process for ratifying. But many states will lay the agreement. So when you sign it, you literally sign on the dotted line. But for ratifying, many states will bring the agreement home, lay it before cabinet, lay it before both houses of parliament, debate it, discuss it, and then agree that they will be bound by it. And at that point, they draft ratification instruments and send it back to the Secretariat who receives them. That's fairly easily done. Some states also go forward and actually draft the legislation that would be necessary to implement the treaty. Now, for this treaty's case, that will be a little bit more onerous. And so my recommendation, contrary to what I usually tell my students, is go ahead and ratify it now, and then as the process develops, draft the legislation. Why? Because the first meeting of the main organ of the BBNJ agreement is the Conference of the Parties. The first meeting will decide many of the rules and the significant things that were debated in the drafting sessions. So I would really want states, CARICOM states in particular, to be there for that first session of the Conference of the Parties. Now, Khalil has already shown you a slide. Mine's a little simpler, but you can see with the red arrows where we have areas beyond national jurisdiction, these little pockets in the Caribbean Sea, and then also beyond our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. So there is some regional relevance for us, but you'll see when we look at the contents of the treaty, it's a little more than just being next to the high seas or next to areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this is the contents, and this slide just simply shows the parts of the treaty. So it has 12 parts and 2 annexes, and what you'll see is that parts 2, 3, and 4 and 5 have very significant substantive contents. So part 2 deals with marine genetic resources, and I'm sure that will be explained shortly, but there's a whole regime for marine genetic resources in the treaty, which can be incredibly valuable in terms of scientific development. Secondly, part 3 deals with area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So if you have marine genetic resources that could be easily damaged, you can create a marine protected area to protect them from harm. Environmental impact assessments, this is Khalil's specialty, which is if you're going to engage in some kind of activity in an area, an environmentally sensitive area, then you would have to do environmental impact assessments. Capacity building and transfer of marine technology. This is of tremendous benefit for the region because through this section or part of the treaty, we could gain capacity building and technology transfer and funding. Institutional arrangements, that's the organs, financial resources, again, funding both for the treaty itself and for capacity building, and then the other sections are fairly obvious. But as you can see, just from this short overview, and I suspect you'll get a little bit more detail later, the treaty is a complex, multifaceted treaty. So what does this mean? Well, I was asked to study how to implement the treaty, and I wrote a report, and there's the title at the top, the final report on the legal obligations arising out of the BBNJ agreement for 3 states. And so what I was asked to do was focus on what do you need to do as a sovereign state to effectively utilize the treaty for your legal system and for your administrative systems and economy, and how to comply with it appropriately. And so I reviewed the agreement, related treaties such as Nagoya Protocol, Convention on Biological Diversity, et cetera, reviewed the legislation of 3 target states, and then issued the report in 2024 with recommendations. I'm going to walk you through in a very summary form some of those recommendations. First, in thinking about a treaty like this, we have to think about what its purpose is. And Article 2 sets out the general objective, which is to ensure the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction for the present and in the long term through effective implementation of the relevant provisions of the convention. This means the Law of the Sea Convention and further international cooperation and coordination. So conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity, but in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this is like the high seas. So all the creatures living in the high seas, in the water column, on the seabed, et cetera, this treaty aims to protect those. And as I've suggested, this is very important because they have genetic resources which would be instrumental for medicine, science, et cetera. Article 53 talks about the binding obligation, and it says that parties shall take the necessary legislative, administrative, or policy measures as appropriate to ensure the implementation of this agreement. Now notice 2 words in this article: parties shall, so it's a mandatory commitment, and to ensure. Ensure is an obligation of result. So when you commit to this treaty, you must not try, you must ensure. The other thing that comes out from looking at the treaty is that it applies not just to marine genetic resources, the wet critters in the high seas, but also to ships that go through the high seas. And so for Caribbean states that have large shipping registries, that have ships that are flagged to that state, there are obligations on those Caribbean states in relation to their ships. And each part of the agreement creates binding legal obligations, and these need to be implemented. And so the focus of my study was on legislation, administrative processes, policies, et cetera. And 2 parts in particular, the area-based management tools and environmental impact assessments, have specific obligations that would need to be thought through for states which are implementing the treaty. But of course, this can be assisted by participation in international treaties and organizations, and I would encourage that as well. So in looking at the 3 states, and I won't go into this in as much detail because of time constraints, I looked at all of the different laws in Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, and St. Lucia, and thought what laws might be affected by the BBNJ agreement, what laws might require changing or fine-tuning, et cetera. And simple things like your fisheries legislation, does that cover only up to 200 nautical miles, which is your exclusive economic zone, or does your fisheries law apply to your vessels which go beyond your exclusive economic zone? So the geographic reach of your legislation would have to be looked at if it would affect your obligations. So I looked at fisheries legislation, marine pollution legislation, environmental management legislation, and you'll see that's underlined in each state. And then ocean jurisdiction enforcement, your ability to send your Coast Guard out, shipping, the cargo vessels that are registered with you, what legislation, what control do you have with them? And I went through all of this legislation at a broad level to think which things would need to be studied, which things might need to be changed, whether new statutes might be needed. And you'd see in the last box, St. Lucia, they did not have, at the time of my study, this is 2024, a very robust environmental management regime. So there is a need for that. There is a need for further legislative implementation. And each Caribbean state would need to do this kind of research to see what laws might need to be changed or what laws would need to be introduced. And I'll talk about one in a moment. But the second thing you need is to administratively implement it. And the question here is, where do you house the BBNJ agreement? What ministry should be the focal ministry? Which ministry should have the focal point for obligations under the agreement? And you'll see I've highlighted 3, and each of them are related to the environment, sustainable development, environment, climate change, et cetera. And the BBNJ agreement could be classified under two different categories. It could be classified as a blue economy instrument. And if you're thinking from economic terms, because the marine genetic resources could generate revenue. So you might think about it as an economic instrument. But I think that that goes against what we learned when we were drafting the agreement about the environmental implications of the agreement and the environmental purpose of the agreement, which is to conserve species. So I would argue that the better place to house the BBNJ agreement would be in an environment ministry. And you'll find that in most of the environment ministries, they contain the focal points for related treaties. So the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. So there would be a more natural fit within those ministries. All right, and in St. Lucia, there is an opportunity to anchor that ministry more firmly in a legislative basis. All right, and then we have the policies, and there are quite a few policy frameworks that could be implicated by the BBNJ agreement. And persons might say, well, why did I highlight for example, the Antigua and Barbuda nationally determined contribution, updated nationally determined contribution? That's climate change. Why am I highlighting that in relation to the BBNJ agreement? Well, as international lawyers who specialize in the law of the sea would know, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, in a recent advisory opinion, has said that climate change, greenhouse gases, are a form of marine pollution. And under the Law of the Sea Convention, under the BBNJ agreement, pollution is definitely not a desirable activity. And so those policies should take into account your obligations under the BBNJ agreement. And I've highlighted a number of policies. Fishing, the BBNJ agreement doesn't really deal with fishing, and in fact, it excludes fishing. But of course, if you have a fishing vessel, that fishing vessel may intrude upon areas of the high seas and do things on the high seas that would damage the marine genetic resources. All right, so those are that's the kind of lens that was employed in this analysis. So first look at legal or legislative changes that may be necessary, and then look at administrative changes. That was primarily focused on what organ of government would be in charge of the BBNJ agreement. And then finally, all the national policies, because policies are maybe not legally binding, but they do set the framework and context for government action. All right, so what did the study suggest? The first thing it suggested is that it would be useful because of the broad reach of the BBNJ agreement, which I think will be explained a little bit more later. Because of the broad reach, the number of sectors that it covers, that you should have a new statute specifically embracing it. And what I argued is that you should create a BBNJ Act, and it would be what we call a force of law statute in the Commonwealth Caribbean, which is a statute that basically says the annex to this act shall have the force of law in Barbados. So the annex to this act shall have the force of law in Trinidad and Tobago. And then in the annex, you reproduce the entire BBNJ treaty. So it just says simply the treaty shall have the force of law. Now that doesn't do everything. Anyone who's a legislative drafter listening will say no, but that does not do it all. So you do have to change your laws, adjust your laws, but at least it gives all of the legal entities in the state a point of reference for their actions, something to justify their actions in support of the BBNJ Act. And I would recommend a force of law statute, that kind of simple form, rather than trying to enact the BBNJ agreement in separate provisions. That's a technical matter, but it's not only faster, but it creates greater uniformity, that we would all have the same kind of statute, greater uniformity in the Caribbean. So the second thing we need to do is amend or create national laws in a range of areas, from fishery to environment to ports, shipping, maritime enforcement, et cetera. And then we would need to provide additional authorization or scope for national ministries, national actors to do things outside of, or to contemplate things being done outside of our national jurisdiction. And this is really interesting about the BBNJ agreement. It necessarily exists outside of where our states usually act. And so, for example, if you have an environmental impact assessment process, you should be able to do that for activities occurring outside your exclusive economic zone. And then I also have suggested that you need to create a focal point for the agreement in a strong ministry with a strong legislative framework with an environmental focus. All right, this leads me to my final observations. And this is really talking about how to conceptualize the treaty in terms of implementation. So firstly, the treaty creates numerous obligations. And in the report that I authored, I had an annex, and the annex was many, many pages long. And it literally went down through every article of the treaty and asked a simple question: does this article impose an obligation on a state or other national actor? And so I went through and I combed through it, and then I said, yes, it does. And then I said, well, what would cause that obligation to arise? What is the triggering event? And then I identified the article, and I either quoted or added some descriptive comments. So 15 pages of just going through the treaty and saying, these are the obligations that arise. This is what we need to take care of in our implementation. And so we will have, under the agreement, numerous obligations that have to be implemented at both the international and national levels through a variety of mechanisms, through statutes, through law, through administrative practices, through policies. Some will be easy to implement. It might require a small change of a statute. Others may require significant change, maybe even creating new administrative structures. However, this can be done, and the study that I did suggests that it can be done in a logical, rational way and successfully implemented. And of course, what I should say is that I have recommended very strongly on every occasion possible to all Caribbean states to not only sign the BBNJ agreement, but also to ratify it, become a party, and as quickly as possible, so that you can participate in the very important negotiations that will be taking place leading up to the first Conference of the Parties and at the Conference of the Parties. And the agreement, as you will hear, has tremendous implications for our economies, for global climate change. The oceans are the huge carbon sink of the world, and they are saving our planet. And if we keep them healthy, they will save our planet more effectively. All of those kind of things. So without further ado, I will end. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Berry. However, we're not going to let you go that quickly, because we do have a couple of questions for you that we hope that you can answer as briefly as possible, but I'll pose the first one now. Which court, the Privy Council or the Caribbean Court of Justice, is better positioned to serve as the final authority for enforcing the BBNJ agreement in the Caribbean region?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the BBNJ agreement is an international treaty. And so neither court technically has competence to enforce the BBNJ agreement. The Privy Council deals with national legal issues. The Caribbean Court of Justice deals with national legal issues in its appellate jurisdiction. In its original jurisdiction, it deals with treaties, but one particular treaty, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which is our regional treaty. Now, the only way that the BBNJ agreement could come up, for example, is if you had a national piece of legislation that was challenged by an entity. And if that's so, then that might go through our national legal processes and then appealed up to the Privy Council or the CCJ. My money would be on the CCJ, which is a regional court and actually knows a little bit about our region. The Privy Council, obviously very well qualified judges, but without the regional knowledge. So that would be my money would be on them.
As a follow-up question, how might the regional focus of the CCJ influence its effectiveness compared to that of the Privy Council in enforcing the BBNJ agreement? Given what you've just said as well, that the Privy Council is a little bit more, popular, for lack of a better word, well respected.
Well, again, the CCJ technically does not have competence to interpret or apply the BBNJ agreement, which is an international treaty. It could interpret national legislation, but that would be in its appellate jurisdiction. But again, the national legislation is always made in a regional context. Regional laws are made in a regional context, and therefore the CCJ would be better able to understand that context. Law is not made in a vacuum. Even if we take similar provisions from other legal systems, the meaning that we give to them may be very different. And even in the example of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, our regional trade agreement, there are articles that are word for word the same as provisions in the Treaty on Functioning of European Union, the EU's treaty, but the way the CCJ reads our treaty is very different than the European Court of Justice or Court of Justice of the European Union.
Professor Berry, thank you so much for your presentation. As you are on your way out, Professor Berry, I do encourage you to take a look at the chat. There might be a couple more questions in there for you if you have the time to respond to them. And there are also some gracious messages to you for such a wonderful presentation as well. So thank you very much, Professor Berry, who is a professor of international law and regional integration law at the University of the West Indies' Cave Hill campus. Moving right along, I'd now like to hand it over to Danalyn Swaby, who's a climate communications strategist out of Jamaica. She will be leading the Q&A's workshop session on CSO mobilization for BBNJ advocacy. Danalyn, it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for the excellent job that you've been doing so far. And to all the presenters, I think it's quite fitting for me to say that we've had quite the experience diving deep into the BBNJ Treaty. And so my role, as mentioned, I think my slides convey more teach when it's really supposed to be reach. And I am really trying to figure out how we're going to coordinate the interactivity with almost 150 people online. So we won't be able to get to all the chats, but the point is for the slides that will be shared, we are all supposed to be, sharing our experiences. So the challenge for me is that whatever I'm doing, I'm supposed to be doing it in 10 minutes. So I wanted to flip the script for everybody, the deep end in 10. I'm throwing everybody off the deep end. So you have to imagine whether, regardless of the capacity that you are here now, we're focusing on the CSO aspect, a civil society organization. So imagine that your civil society organization has been tasked with leading a campaign to build public and government support for the BBNJ Treaty. What would you prioritize? I'm not going to give you the whole 10 minutes. You just have to imagine that you have 10 minutes. And so I want you to think about your core audience, think about your message, the advocacy actions and the channels. So I want to see what you prioritize. So you have the option of speaking to any of those that I just mentioned, and maybe I'll just grab. I'm looking to see if there has been any comments in the chat so far. So this is posted to everyone. Based on what we've heard today too, because the presentations were instructive as they were informative. So if you had that opportunity to convince your government or drum up public support for the BBNJ Treaty, based on what has been presented today, based on your previous experience, what would be some of the key things that you'd prioritize? Let's not, is the chat going all quiet on me? All right, I'm gonna give I really hope that everybody is just really brainstorming right now and I'm not experiencing virtual crickets, but just proceeding to the next slide while I will just, check for interaction after. So the whole context of my engagement today is around advocacy communication and advocacy campaigns, especially for treaties like this. And so one of the first, if I should link back to even my communications experience out of university, our lecturer used to caution us, a lot of things that the common challenge or mistake that people tend to make is immediately go to the channels. And so even listening to the conversation today, especially for something very layered, as a BBNJ treaty, awareness is important and the channel is important, but there's a whole lot of back-end work that has to happen. So awareness, educating stakeholders about the treaty is something that is quite critical for us to do. And so awareness doesn't also mean, it's not just about your traditional or social media channels. It's about that deep dive into what the treaty is all about so that we can pick apart what are the important elements or actions that you want to have emerging from your process. Engagement as well. This is also linked to the back-end support, identifying the stakeholders, from the previous presenters, we looked at, we would have heard coming out from those presentations, the legal framework, the policy framework, the technical framework. And so it's important that we look at massaging the process when it comes to this treaty. So it's not just about the public creative engagement at this point, but who are the stakeholders that you would need to bring on board in generating public support for a treaty such as the BBNJ. And then you would lead to your action stage, looking at mobilizing for visible and measurable outcomes. So I like to interpret the closed loop communication system. So the closed loop communication, looking at whenever I deliver a message or a communication output, it's not just about putting it out there. I have to ensure that it is received. And so when it comes to advocacy communications, we have to ensure what purpose is my advocacy action linking back to. I see RJ online, and I saw something about a petition as part of the High Seas Youth Ambassador Program. And so something like that is very critical. If I'm putting information out there specifically for a treaty and for advocacy communication, what impact do I want this to have? So it also has to link back to a call to action. Now I'm gonna pause a little bit to check. Okay, still rolling. All right. And so another aspect of thinking about advocacy communication, framing the issue for public relevance. Whilst the discussions were very important today, and it provided us that deep dive and insight for the BBNJ Treaty, we have to recognize that the different strategies for communication and approaches are as vast and unlimited as the ocean itself. And so to people who may not be sitting inside a webinar or a lecture or some other technical dialogue, how is it that we make policy-heavy material, information around treaty, relevant and incorporate it in persons' daily lives? So we have to think about how it's linked to livelihoods. How is this linked to fisheries, tourism, coastal economies, the cultural identity? I still think that there is a vast opportunity for us to tap into that emotional connectivity as to what the ocean means and represents for us as a Caribbean region. Or I am fully aware that we have other guests who may be from Asia Pacific or other island nations and so forth. So I think that's something that we also need to consider, increasing ocean literacy in a way that the minute that we hear about treaties like this, it inspires conviction to support, to press for engagement through our connection. Climate resilience, that is also something critical. I just heard from one of the conversation that climate change and greenhouse gas emissions contribute to marine pollution. And so we also have to ensure that there's this element of connectivity. How can we demonstrate biodiversity protection, and how does protection of the sustainable use of marine resources linked to safeguarding us against climate impacts and extremes, something that affects lives, livelihoods, and our economic bottom line as a region? So how are we making it relevant? And so I mentioned this before about the call to action. Very important that when we identify the goals of an advocacy campaign or a communication effort, how are we outlining the tangible goals that people can work towards? So in the case of a BBNJ treaty, if it's ratification, how is it that different entities and diverse stakeholders can contribute to ratification? How is it that they can contribute to local outreach? How is it that we can contribute to public education campaigns? So share your examples. It may not be a BBNJ treaty, but you might be a member of a CSO, or you can recall an initiative that has been led by a CSO, whether locally, regionally, or internationally. What has been your experience, or what is your idea of how an effective call to action can be developed? What channel can you use? What channel did you use if you had experience in this case? So the whole point of this engagement is to explore how we can learn from each other. Ryan, I'm just gonna ask you, if you're able to see the chat, you can just give a visual indication if there are comments specifically to the point of discussion that I raised. Sorry, I seem to be skipping ahead.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I can give you a quick overview of what people are saying. Samantha Telesford says we must first educate the public through simple channels. These consultations with stakeholders must include the input of the public. The reason being is because persons want to know how this can benefit them, and they will support the cause. Emma says, that's why I said you must prioritize audience before everything else, cultural factors, etc. Alina says, inspire conviction through connection. Love it. And yeah, that's what we have so far.
All right, thank you. Love it. And those are spot on comments and feedback, and ties back to what we had said about framing the issues for public relevance. Everybody has a role to play. When I listen to Professor Berry deep diving into the legal framework, the policy before with our previous presenter. And so not everybody is able to dissect that on an individual level. So what does that mean for fisher folk? What does that mean for people in the coastal community? What does that mean for youth organizations or high schoolers, or, you know, the hotel industry? We live in a very ocean-centric regional economy. So everybody has a vested interest, but if we are pushing an advocacy initiative, the responsibility is on us to identify and to target our communication to align with the different interest groups that exist. And one of them, this brings me to my next point in terms of leveraging storytelling and participatory approaches. We have to do so in a way that marries culture and policy. So how can we make this personal? Highlighting stories about ocean biodiversity using traditional media, its articles, its opinion, op-eds, as well as news features, online media, if it's Instagram, if it's TikTok, if it's YouTube, podcast, docuseries, all of that. And how are we finding ways to integrate this in our daily lives? I need another example, as I have one on the board. Fish for thought is a concept that I came up with while reflecting on this presentation. And it brings me back to when I used to visit B&D Trawling, which is a local restaurant in Jamaica. I used to love going to B&D Trawling for Fish Fry Fridays. And it was to my delight, one day I saw that they had a board talking about Save the Parrot Fish. And that was very commendable for a seafood restaurant to be promoting the protection of parrotfish because of the environmental service that the parrotfish provides. And so there are so many other creative and functional ways that we can incorporate the tidbits of awareness that links to BBNJ. How are we incorporating it into menus? If you're scanning using a QR code, if it's a physical menu at the back, how does that link back to the call to action and overall information around the treaty? So that's just one. Palau, a Pacific island nation, or in Micronesia, they have an example where their pledge campaign was used to engage the public and visitors in protecting the country's marine biodiversity. So visitors were required to sign an environmental pledge as part of their visa application process. And I think that's a very direct and impactful way of ensuring that we're marrying the policy, marrying the culture, and that people who have an interest, tourists who are looking to come to these countries, also undertake that responsibility of what it means to be protecting and promoting sustainable use of the ocean and marine resources. This came out in several of the presentations prior to this, the power of partnerships and public participation in one way or the other. So collaborating to be great. Local groups, youth organizations, regional CSOs, and international bodies. We have different levels of resources outside of just funding. It could just be reach in terms of communication. It could be regional bodies and organizations that have the experience interpreting the legal frameworks and advocating for regional treaties or environmental treaties, as well as collaborating to expand communication efforts. Engagement with educational, cultural, research, and legal institutions also critical. In the same way, when I listened to Professor Berry, I thought that engaging students at the law students could also be a way that we tap into new champions for the BBNJ Treaty. Another initiative looking at interactive digital campaigns and citizen science. How can we secure public participation aside from, I don't want to say using the magic bullet treaty, but ensuring that people are not just having a one-way communication channel. So I've participated in BioBlitz before, where people are going out into nature, recording what they're seeing and capturing. This has been done in several countries before, where you're looking at, you know, recording marine debris, or it can be an application that's developed to more suit our purpose here. Gamification for advocacy awareness. Not everybody, as I said before, maybe will be wrapping their minds around legal speak and the technical elements of a treaty. But gamifying the process is another aspect of immersive learning that can move people from awareness, can move them to appreciation, and can also move them to action. So these are a few considerations as to how we can continue to raise public support. Somebody just also shared fun and insightful but humorous messaging like ratifying the High Seas Treaty could create, I'm sorry, I think it jumped, marine protected areas that increase fish stocks by up to 600%, which could bring in X dollars for economic benefits. The cost of protecting these areas is just X dollars, just X a year, roughly the same as what we spend on ice cream annually. It's a small price to pay for a massive return, not just for our ocean, but for our economy and future generations. When you look at the numbers, it's clear. Protecting our ocean now means securing long-term prosperity. And that's a solid intervention, Ajay. Explain it to me like I'm 5. You bring in ice cream, now everybody's speaking the same language. So looking at relatable analogies to break down what it means when we're talking about protection and ratification of treaties, that's exactly the kind of direction that we would need to go. Indigenous communities are an overlooked part of the citizen science movement. Well said. And so we need to be looking at ensuring when we're prioritizing our audience or segmenting our audience. Emma mentioned about the considering cultural factors. So you have to know what your national or local context is to know that which interest group should be at the forefront of engagement. And the indigenous community play a very solid role in almost all contexts when we speak about matters of environment and environment justice. And so we also have to ensure that they're on the front line. I really love that inclusion, Stacey. Thank you so much for that. And now I'm just wrapping up because I know I have Ruth coming on board with further questions for everybody for engagement. Some of the key takeaways for BBNJ advocacy is humanizing the issue. So framing marine biodiversity loss or protection as food security, livelihood, and climate problem. Maybe I should have changed that from problem to imperative. How are we leveraging local governments and businesses, getting our coastal communities or business sector or marine and fishery sector to show up and support first? And I think it was also discussed in the chat, the messaging, simple and compelling, focus on what people will lose without BBNJ protection. So this new treaty for people who have no clue what it means, how will the ratification of this treaty make our lives better? What benefit is it bringing to our country? What benefit is it bringing to our region? That has to be clearly articulated for us to achieve larger stakeholder buy-in. Make it visual and participatory. Art, video, storytelling, and public challenges will always help to boost engagement and regional peer pressure. I saw that on a slide earlier as well. How can we track which Caribbean governments have or have not ratified the treaty? Whether it's an individual level, a company, a country, or otherwise, we always feel cute when we get called out, but sometimes it's effective. And so having certain trackers and mapping the status of ratification is also a good way of accountability and pressing for positive change or progress in relation to that. And so I will wrap up. It was very hard to condense a lot of these things in 10 minutes, but as I said before, advocacy communication efforts are as vast and unlimited as the ocean. And if I didn't even explore enough, as I saw that we have participation from the Jamaica Climate Change Youth Council and the High Seas ambassadors, we have to also underscore always prioritizing youth, leading engagement, leading initiatives, because the resonance for these matters always unparalleled. So we always have to prioritize that in the engagement. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going to head straight across to Ruth. Thank you very much, Dana Lynn. And we're going to head straight across to Ruth.
Thank you. I love the people. I believe in the people. So I'll go the extra miles to ensure that the people in our communities, the people in our churches, the people in our schools know about the BBNJ. We want local ownership and buy-in of this process. The power is in the people. And if only our advocacy is bold, if our advocacy goes the extra miles to empower them, to teach them, to hear their ideas, we have much that we will accomplish. Today, there's a call for action. The call for action is for us to leave our offices, leave our places of abode, and go to the communities. Go where the people are so that we can include them. We can involve them in this process. I see questions in the chat asking about if these communities were included, if they got information before we started this process. And I must say the answer is no. But now we as CSOs are involved in this process. We need to build the partnerships. We need to break the silos. We need to overcome the barriers that prevent the people from becoming effective stakeholder participants in this process. I know time is going widely, but we need that commitment and dedication. We need our fishers on board. Our timings may not suit their timings, but we have to make that extra effort, go the extra miles to ensure that we build the bonds with our local people. Because without their being involved, who is going to implement? Implementation takes place with the people. On the high seas, we have the fishers with a lot of local knowledge. They're the stewards on the waters, and we need to know from them what they see happening. We need to strengthen the advocacy. So today, my call for action is for CSOs to take on new roles and responsibilities. Let us go and meet the people. Let us work together so that we can have an effective stakeholder engagement when we implement the BBNJ. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you so much. Such passion in your voice, such rawness in your voice. That's how a lot of people like to hear it. Not politically correct. They like to hear it straight on, the way you delivered it. Ruth Spencer, we so appreciate you, the Chair of Marine Ecosystems, Protected Areas Trust from Antigua and Barbuda. Truly appreciate you making the time to be with us this afternoon, Ruth. Thank you very much. We now move on to our panel on the key sections of the BBNJ Treaty. And to do this, we'll have the help of three excellent people. And I want to introduce them now. Professor Judith Gobin from the Marine Genetic Resources in Trinidad and Tobago, Nicola Clark from Pew Charitable Trust, MPAs and ABNJs, and then Danielle Cashel-Race, who is from cross-cutting coordinator, who is the cross-cutting coordinator at High Seas Alliance, EIAs, and CBTT. I'm going to hand you over now for the panel on the key sections of the BBNJ Treaty. That includes the marine genetic resources, environmental impact assessments, marine protected areas, and capacity building and technology transfer. Professor Gobin, are you there with us?
Yes, Ryan, I'm here.
Absolutely love having you with us, Professor Gobin. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You should be hearing me clearly.
Yes, I'm hearing you clearly. And are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, hearing you very clearly.
Presentation.
We're seeing your presentation very clearly as well, and we can't wait to see what you have for us. Thank you, Professor Gobin.
Well, I'm always happy that I get to be the one showing lovely pictures. So before I get into it, just to let everyone know that all of this material is our material. This is Caribbean biodiversity. And I'm so pleased to be talking a little bit about the importance of our marine resources and specifically the marine genetic resources, which is, of course, a component, a very important component of the BBNJ Treaty. And just to remind everyone, I mean, we know what marine resources are. We are oceans people. We depend on the oceans for all the resources, for the fisheries, for all the different sort of activities that we do at sea. But there's this sort of unseen bit that's a marine genetic resource, which is any material or of marine plant, animal, microbial, or other origin containing a functional unit of heredity of actual or potential value. And that's as scientific as we're going to get. We're not going to get any more scientific than that, because I've listened to Dana Lynn and I've listened to Ruth, and I've tried to keep this so that we could be really, truly engaging. Now, one of the questions about why the deep sea, because we're talking biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, why are the deep sea species, specimens and organisms so important when it comes to actually being a marine genetic resource, or from which we extract marine genetic resources? So think about it, deep sea resources, we're talking animals, organisms that are living 1,000 meters, 4,000 meters. Don't forget my pictures. All the pictures are Caribbean organisms, all Caribbean, potentially marine genetic resources. And what that means is these deep sea organisms, they are living at extremely deep depths. As I mentioned, it's very, very cold. There's limited food sources. It is very dark. So deep sea organisms are very special. They live in a very not so great environment. It is full of challenges, and yet they survive. And that is actually, it's that resilience, being able to survive the extreme conditions of deep sea living, that makes the genetic resource, that genetic material that we're interested in, so very important and critical. So what happens is, when deep sea samples and deep sea organisms are collected, they are taken into a laboratory where the marine genetic resource, the genetic material, the makeup of the organism is extracted. And it's this extracted material that is central to the BBNJ agreement. That is what is now then subjected to experimental processes, procedures, and eventually, as I have in the extreme bottom right there, where for years this sort of research has been going on. And there was the research on the Caribbean sponge, Cryptotethia, was in 1951, was experimental work was done on it with the similar sorts of extractions as I've just mentioned. And it was done for the treatment. A drug was processed, commercialized later for the treatment of acute meningeal leukemia. So that is the type of process that happens with when you extract a marine genetic resource and take it to commercialization, as I've got in the last bullet on this slide. The thing to remember, though, and to bear in mind is it is a very long process. It doesn't happen overnight. This takes years. And this is what is very interesting. It has been going on for a long time in the Caribbean region. So I've got this slide saying before BBNJ, there was no equitable sharing of the benefits. We didn't know what was happening. It was basically ships passing in the night where collections were made, taken outside of the region and experimented on by pharmaceuticals companies, the developed countries with the laboratory skills, with the technical skills, to take the process right through to something that was marketable and then obviously commercialized. So before the BBNJ, and at the moment, it's still ongoing, where it's still what we have in the Caribbean. Very few marine scientists, first of all, very few, and even less deep sea scientists. We need, then we also, that translates to no access to the deep sea environment, and therefore no access to the deep sea samples. There's also, in parallel with that, we've had a lack of scientific opportunities. Sure, the deep sea research vessels that I mentioned, they have come into the region, and they come very frequently, but the opportunities for getting our scientists on board are not great. They were never open. A lot of times, as I said, it's ships passing in the night. We weren't even sure what they were doing and what samples they were collecting. Having said that, deep sea science is very expensive. Ship time is extremely, it could go to, it could be 20,000 US a day, and that'll just be for ship time coming into your region. And of course, the equipment, it's very sophisticated, very high-tech sampling equipment. It's the use of remotely operated vehicles. The setup has got to be very, big, high technology setup that, of course, we have not had and we still don't have in the region. At the same time, there are very few institutions involved in marine genetic resources and the sort of skills that I've just tried to describe for you, simply the molecular tools for this sort of high resolution observations and the sequencing of DNA. Very, very few labs in the Caribbean region are engaging in this type of sequencing. So this was the scenario before the BBNJ. With the BBNJ, there is, like the video said, there is now some a shining light. What was it? It said, yeah, there's light yet, and there's hope, because there is now an opportunity for us to be part of this fair and equitable sharing, not like it was before. And of course, key to there are two separate sort of ideas. One, which is monetary, which is, of course, very key for us. It's what we would want to be, getting the sort of what's due to us. So if there's a Caribbean sponge or a Caribbean coral that and they have been used in the last number of years, there should be some coming in, some value coming down to us. And that will be decided, of course, whether it's in milestone payments, a percentage of revenue, or tiered fee, and that's sort of straight out of the actual treaty. For us scientists, what is really more, perhaps that much more important, of course, monies and financing and funding is very key to all of this, but it's really the non-monetary benefits, which include capacity building and that transfer of marine technology. And that's what I'm really very excited about. The treaty is science-based. So for marine scientists, that's really exciting. And for our region, it's exciting and interesting and very necessary. It's come at a good time when we can really beef up capacity. Now we will be able to, once we get to the ratifying and so on, and we all become parties, we will have access to deep sea samples. The opportunities will open up for us. In the treaty language, it talks about developed country scientists ensuring that they collaborate, that they improve and increase on the opportunities, and they share those opportunities with us in developed countries to get our scientists on board, to get our scientists in their laboratories. It's a collaboration. So we really need to look at it like in that sense. It's a collaborative effort. We also expect that there will be increased training opportunities in the application of the marine genetic resource tools and techniques, which I've alluded to, which are very high-tech and need special sort of laboratory settings and special types of equipments. The treaty language includes the fact that developed country scientists will be assisting us in building sustainable numbers of trained scientists to continue to work with us, collaborate with us, to continue the networking, and of course, a variety of other things like workshops and training sessions and so on. So there is light, as that video that I really enjoyed said, there is the light, and that's what I really love about this treaty, is that it is, as I mentioned, it takes into account small island developing states like our Caribbean SIDS, and therefore our region stands to benefit. Having said that, we must be prepared. So there are Caribbean priorities that we need to. We have an opportunity. There is this light, but we need to make the necessary investments in order that we are able to get those benefits of the fair and equitable sharing. We need then to invest in marine science and research, institutional capacity, and human capacity. It's fine to have the collaborative efforts from the developed countries, but we need to also set ourselves up, because we are the ones going to be having to build the actual capacity in our region. We therefore need to invest in regional centers. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can invest in our regional centers, those centers and designated centers of excellence at UWI and other universities. There's the Belize University, Ghana University, Suriname. We have institutions like the Institute of Marine Affairs. Let us ensure that our region and our governments, and this is where advocacy comes in, and we need everyone, Dana, Lynn, and Ruth have already said it, we need to make sure that our region has these as, and addresses these as priorities, because we need to sustain the human and the institutional capacity. We need to also think, it's something that's a beef of mine, where we need to create and sustain marine scientific jobs. We don't have enough in the region. As a very recently retired University of the West Indies lecturer here at the St. Augustine campus, I've taught so many really amazing students. They're very keen, they're very active, they're making a difference in the field of marine science, but there's really no jobs. Now there's an opportunity, because of what we in the Caribbean need to ensure that we put in place. We need to ensure that we create jobs for marine scientists so that it's going to be sustained. They are going to invest because we invest in them, our governments invest in them, and they are then going to invest in terms of time and really building on the capacity. The integrated approach is necessary. At the same time, within the region, we need to coordinate how we are moving forward. It's a very, as I mentioned, a high-tech area. It's not an area that we are all going to be able to take to fruition, take to completion, getting to that sort of commercialization stage. Unless we have an integrated and a coordinated approach, because we are competing for limited funds and limited opportunities. But we have an arrangement already. We are CARICOM SIDS. Therefore, that's the arrangement we should be working through, that coordination, to ensure that the funding, the opportunities, the collaborations, the training opportunities, and so on, that it's funneled through the regional organization, the CARICOM organization, so that we can then build in terms of capacity, we can build in terms of institution at a regional level. We don't need to have 10 deep sea biologists in any one state or island. What we need is to have a group of experts in the Caribbean SIDS. It is therefore very urgent, and this is where, of course, all the wonderful information and guidance we've had from Dana, Lynn, and Ruth. We need you. We need your voices. This is my homework to you. I couldn't quite engage you in asking questions before, but we need you to assist us getting our states. There's just really, it was only 3. David showed us on the slide. Only 3 have actually ratified. We need our states and our CARICOM SIDS, our islands, to ratify, or else we would not have changed the scenario. We would be back to pre-BBNJ days. Let us take this forward. CARICOM SIDS must participate in the first round of the COP, the Conference of Parties. This is where key decisions on all of this, including the funding arrangements, including the collaborations for the marine genetic resources section, this is where it's going to be made, the scientific committees and so on. So CARICOM SIDS must ensure that they are at the table to maintain what is reflected in the governance of the ABNJ, the earnest and equitable intentions. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gobin. And like a true professor, she leaves us with homework to do. Thank you very much, Professor Gobin. And we're going to jump right in and hand it over to Nicola. Nicola, so glad you could join us.
Thank you very much for having me. Let me just get my screen shared. And we'll get that in presentation mode. We'll wait a little bit for the technology to work with us. All right, is that showing up for everyone?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this really incredible webinar. It's amazing to see all of the talent and expertise that's already been on full display here. And I'm delighted to talk to you about my favorite nerdy topic to get into, the BBNJ Treaty, and more specifically talking about area-based management tools and marine protected areas, those provisions within the BBNJ Treaty. So to begin with, I thought it might be helpful because I think I find a lot of people within the treaty text itself, for most of the time, it refers to area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. And we sort of see this again and again. And so I think it's helpful to maybe just start out by sharing what the actual treaty text says about how it defines these two different terms. I promise I'm not gonna, this is gonna be the most text heavy portion, I hope, of my slides, and I won't be quoting the treaty text throughout. But I think, at least when we're talking about definitions, it's a little helpful if I show you how the BBNJ Treaty defines these two terms. So for area-based management tools, it again clarifies that this could be a tool including a marine protected area, but that's not, they're not one and the same. For a geographically defined marine area through which one or several sectors or activities are managed with the aim of achieving particular conservation and sustainable use objectives in accordance with the agreement. Marine protected areas, by contrast, are defined as a geographically defined marine area that is designated and managed to conserve specific long-term biological diversity conservation objectives, and may allow, where appropriate, sustainable use activities provided it's consistent with the conservation objectives. Now, I just want to spend a moment to emphasize the sort of distinctions, because I will admit that they can be a little bit murky, especially when we're talking about implementation. So again, to emphasize that area-based management tools refers to a broad category of tools that we can use to manage the marine areas. So it can include things like marine protected areas, but it also could include other tools. So if you look to other types of governing bodies, other types of ocean governance bodies, you see that some fisheries management bodies create fisheries closures to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems. You have the International Maritime Organization that creates particularly sensitive sea areas to provide special protections to areas from shipping. So there's different types of area-based management tools. Marine protected areas are just one type. And what distinguishes them, at least according to the BBNJ Treaty, really comes down to the objectives. So whereas area-based management tools as the broad category can have both conservation and sustainable use objectives, marine protected areas have specifically conservation objectives. And within that conservation objective, it's more specifically to aim for long-term conservation. Now, just to muddy the waters a bit, I find oftentimes, when we're talking about marine protected areas, people assume that means the entire area is no take, no activities, no nothing. And it's not necessarily the case. Again, even within the treaty definition, it allows for the possibility that you could allow for some activities, some sorts of sustainable use, ensuring that that sustainable use is consistent with the conservation objectives. So I think it's a little, and it'll be tricky to see in practice as well. But generally speaking, marine protected areas are those that really are focused on conservation and achieving those conservation goals. So why do high seas marine protected areas matter? So I think I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this one at all, but just in case, we all know that the health of the ocean is declining under increased stresses from destructive human activities, climate change, pollution. I could go on. Marine protected areas are one of the most powerful tools that we have in our tool belt for protecting habitat species and areas that are critical to marine life. And scientific studies have shown that they do a variety of things. They safeguard biodiversity. They protect top predators, which in turn help ensure and maintain ecosystem balance. They can even do things like build resilience to climate change. Now, scientists have said that we need to protect at least 30% of the ocean. And governments, in fact, have actually committed to that target as a conservation target. And just mathematically speaking, I want to point out that the high seas actually cover almost 2/3 of the ocean. So there are vast, vast area of space. And I'm curious if I want to sort of pause for a second and ask the audience, how much of the high seas would you guess is currently protected via an MPA? I gotta thank you for the magicians who made that poll happen. So take a couple of minutes and well, by a couple, I mean a minute. We'll give people a minute to fill in this poll. I was generous with a minute. Maybe we'll give people maybe 10 more seconds. All righty. And the results. Okay, so most people thought that it was about 1%, and most people are correct. So it's about 1% of the high seas that are currently protected. And that all comes from a really, really small spot in the high seas that's in the Antarctic, which is a really special case, both legally and biologically speaking. So you have that 1% is pretty much all coming from a massive marine protected area in the Southern Ocean called the Ross Sea MPA. But the challenge is that for most of the high seas, it's actually been we have not had a legal mechanism by which we could actually protect the high seas. It wasn't possible, again, for most of the high seas, with the exception of that Antarctic region. It wasn't possible for countries, even if they wanted to create an MPA to protect the high seas. And so now this is why the BBNJ Treaty is so exciting, because it presents a long-awaited opportunity to address that critical governance gaps and to empower and enable governments and the global community to work together to protect these really, really important places in our ocean. So how does the treaty actually do that? What does it say? Some key things that this chapter of the new BBNJ agreement does. First, it empowers the new BBNJ Conference of Parties to create high seas marine protected areas and associated management measures, which is really important. And it sets it out that it is actually an objective of the agreement to create a connected network of high seas MPAs. And this is going to be really critical if we want to stay on track to meet this goal of protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. It allows marine protected areas to be established by a vote when consensus can't be reached. This is so important because if you are in this world at all, you may have noticed that it's been a real challenge to secure any additional marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean in Antarctica, because that particular treaty requires consensus, and they've been at a stalemate for years and years, having not been able to meet consensus and therefore not been able to create new protected areas around the really fragile waters of Antarctica. And so the BBNJ Treaty learns from that example and actually creates a mechanism to vote when consensus can't be reached. I also think it's really important to point out that it sets that it is, again, an objective of this ABMT and MPA chapter to ensure that you have that you build capacity and you transfer technology to support developing countries in developing MPA proposals, as well as in monitoring and managing those MPAs once they're established. And then a fourth kind of cool thing that I think that chapter does is it allows the new BBNJ body to adopt measures to respond to natural or human-caused emergencies. Now, a couple of caveats. So there's an obligation for the BBNJ Treaty to respect the competences of existing bodies like fisheries bodies and shipping bodies. There's ambiguity, there's constructive ambiguity, and we're going to have to wait and see what it is the will of states to before we really have an understanding of what that means in practice. There's a risk that it could be taken advantage of to lower the ambition in BBNJ implementation. A second challenge or limitation is the objection procedure. And I almost hesitant to say it because the Caribbean in particular was an incredibly strong champion in trying to fight against this objection procedure, which absolutely could be taken advantage of. It could theoretically create a bit of a loophole in the BBNJ agreement. CARICOM was a really vocal champion trying to fight against that. But what they did try and make sure happened is that if there was going to be an objection procedure, it at least was going to have some constraints. So it does, while it allows parties to opt out of measures, there are the sort of checks on the opt-out are a party can only opt out under certain conditions. It's still obliged to not undermine the measures that it's opting out of, and it has to renew its objection every 3 years. Again, still room for abuse, but at least there's some constraints there, and it's in large part to the Caribbean region's efforts to get some additional protections to fight against that possible loophole. And then on emergencies, I'll say that BBNJ can only act in emergencies if the threat can't be addressed by other bodies in a timely manner. And I just want to quickly point out that it will be absolutely key for countries to join the BBNJ COP so that they can ensure that this ambition for BBNJ is realized and that loopholes aren't abused. So I'll just underscore those calls for Caribbean countries to be part of the first BBNJ COP, so you can continue your legacy of trying to prevent abuse of the environment and to ensure that these measures are used for ambitious conservation of the ocean. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to just breeze through the ABMT establishment process in case that's of interest. Step 1 is to submit a proposal. Step 2, there's formal consultations that have to happen as part of the proposal, including with other management bodies like fisheries bodies, as well as with Indigenous people and with local communities. These are all required, as well as with scientists, civil society, and other stakeholders. The proponent of that proposal would consider all of that feedback from the consultation, possibly revise. It then goes to the BBNJ's scientific body, which would review, provide an assessment and recommendations, and then it's up to the BBNJ Conference of Parties, so to those countries who have joined and are party to BBNJ, to take a decision on whether or not to establish the marine protected area. And in case the slides are shared, I've written that out in a little more detail for people who would want to see that in more detail. And then just my final slide is on thinking about implementation and how we prepare for it. So there's so much work that can be done right now while countries work to ratify. And specifically some work that could be done to help prepare for future BBNJ marine protected areas includes stakeholder engagement, understanding which areas are going to be important to which stakeholder groups and what it is that they want to protect within them. The second is building the scientific case. So working with scientists in your region to collect and analyze existing data and supporting scientific research that would fill gaps that exist in data. And then finally, just thinking about other implementation needs. So thinking about how BBNJ's marine protected areas will be monitored, enforced, reviewed, and financed. With that, I will thank you all for your attention and looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We really appreciate it, Nicola. We're going to jump right to Danielle, who is a cross-cutting coordinator at the High Seas Alliance. Danielle, so great to have you with us.
Ryan, let me just quickly make sure that you should be seeing a blue screen right now, and hopefully you see a presentation. Excellent.
Now we're seeing your presentation.
Super. I'll take it from there. So, great presentation so far. I have the pleasure to take you through the 2 remaining main parts of the agreement. I think it's probably still useful for context to note that when countries were considering to embark on the negotiations of the BBNJ agreement, they eventually came to that decision on the basis of a 2011 package. And they said that these are the 4 main parts they want to include in the agreement, and they care greatly about advancing them at an equal step. And that influenced a lot of the negotiations. You've heard from Professor Judith Gobin on the MGR part, and from Nicola on the ABMT and MPA part. So I will cover the environmental impact assessment part and the capacity building and transfer of marine technology part. So Nicola made a great case for how important MPAs and area-based management tools are for protecting specific geographic areas. But of course, there's also likely going to be a part of the ocean. So if we think about the 30 by 30 goal, 70%, that are not going to be protected in area-based management tools or MPAs. And so the environmental impact assessment part is really key to also extending some protections to the parts that aren't covered with MPAs. And overall, to strengthen and manage human activities throughout the ocean, throughout ABNJ. I think Professor David Barry mentioned that it's one of the trickier parts of the agreement to implement in national law. And so I will do some simplifications in the way that I'm presenting it. But overall, the scope of the provision is that it applies to any planned activities that are either happening in areas beyond national jurisdiction, or even activities within national jurisdiction that apply or that might have an effect on areas beyond national jurisdiction. There is a thresholds approach, a tiered approach. So if there is more than a minor or transitory effect, or the activity is unknown, or people are not sure what impact it would have, there's a screening. And then if a state finds in doing the screening that it may cause substantial pollution of or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment, it has to conduct a full EIA under the BBNJ agreement. The decision-making in this case, and I'm jumping around a little bit in the order, is national. And during the negotiations, there was sort of a big interest to have international decision-making. But the Caribbean, again, was very instrumental in sort of fighting for that, and also in getting the agreement that we now have on environmental impact assessments. And so one of the ways that this international decision-making is still coming in, despite decision-making being national, is that there is a possibility to register concern when a state, after the screening, decides that it won't have a substantial effect on the marine environment, but other states have a concern about that. There's something called the called-in mechanism, where they can get the scientific and technical body to also review this. Overall, there's a big focus on transparency and establishing modern standards. There's also some provisions that relate to how environmental impact assessments under other existing bodies can be recognized, but only if they are equivalent to the EIA process under BBNJ. There are many instances in that process where information needs to be notified to a clearinghouse mechanism, so sort of a central information hub, and that by itself will greatly increase transparency for activities that have an impact on ABNJ. And then if an activity gets authorized, there are obligations to monitor the impacts of these activities. And again, there is a possibility for states that have concerns about the activity having more effects than was found in the EIA to engage this call-in mechanism. This is sort of the process, and I'll just quickly breeze through it again. So there's a screening part, a scoping part. There are quite a lot of elements that bring the BBNJ environmental impact assessment to a modern standard for EIAs in the scoping, what needs to be considered. In the assessment and evaluation, cumulative impact, so the impacts of multiple things affecting the marine environment in ABNJ at the same time need to be considered. There is a requirement to identify measures to prevent and manage a planned activity. And then, as I said, a lot of focus on notification, transparency, and then monitoring. The second part I'll try to cover within the short time available is the capacity building and transfer marine technology part. And I think that was already alluded to quite a bit from other speakers. One statement that I remember from the negotiations was a delegate from the Global South saying, this is about helping us to become the partner you need to stem the biodiversity and climate crisis, sort of directed towards the developed countries. And it includes an obligation for states to cooperate on capacity building and with some caveats on the transfer of marine technology on fair terms, with a focus on enabling and assisting developing countries to implement the agreement and advance marine scientific research. So there's, and that was also said already a few times, always this focus on improving and fostering marine scientific research. There's special recognition for the circumstances and needs of landlocked countries. There are quite a few provisions in terms of how that committee will be set. The committee will be set up, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Capacity building and transfer of marine technology is supposed to be based on needs assessments, and it's one of the things that can potentially already happen now, because one of the options for these needs assessments is to be self-assessed. There's a way to sort of get ahead of implementation, and there are some examples for capacity building in the annex. It's worth noting that the Law of the Sea Convention, which is sort of the mother convention of BBNJ, BBNJ is one of its implementing agreements, already did include provisions on capacity building and technology transfer, but generally those are considered to be not well implemented. And there's a few ways in which BBNJ improves on those provisions by establishing a monitoring and review process for the capacity building obligations, a dedicated committee that has ownership of that part of the treaty and can make recommendations of how to improve it. And then there's a built-in funding stream based from the monetary benefits that Professor Judith talked about from MGRs and from the Global Environment Facility that would fund these activities. So several speakers have already alluded to the fact that there will be quite a lot of important decisions made at COP1 because the treaty leaves a lot of key details, in particular of how specific sort of institutions that it creates, how they will work in practice. And those decisions will be made at COP1, but because it's quite a lot, the High Seas Alliance and others have called early on for a preparatory commission to be established that can start to prepare some of that work, that can deliberate on how all of these bits and pieces are supposed to be fit together. The General Assembly passed a resolution to establish a preparatory committee. It already held its first organizational meeting from 24 to 26 June. We had put forward a few recommendations of what we would hope from a civil society perspective to emerge from that meeting, and see it as quite positive. For example, an ambitious schedule of PrepCom meetings that allows for sufficient time to address all of these issues. And there will be 2 full sessions, 2 times 2 weeks in 2025, and at least 1 additional 2-week session in 2026. An ambitious program of work to facilitate early operationalization and implementation. The program of work that we got is quite focused on the institutions themselves. but still a win. And then working modalities that emphasize transparency and aim to minimize the demands on small delegations, and making sure we can engage in technical discussions. And again, that's mostly been the case. Maybe just to round off, because I know I'm running out of time, there are a few institutional elements I want to draw your attention to on the environmental impact assessment and capacity building and transformative technology parts. Some of the issues that are for discussion at the PrepCom are things like the rules of procedure, the size, the membership, the selection of the membership, modalities of how the body operates, including how it collaborates or interacts with other subsidiary bodies established by the agreement, the frequency of meetings, terms of reference. And for example, the scientific and technical body specifically is supposed to establish a roster of experts on environmental impact assessments. That's one of these provisions that will be important to flesh out going forward. The clearinghouse mechanism is quite central in many ways. And for example, Professor Judith Govan mentioned that building on centers of excellence is really important. And so the clearinghouse mechanism might be able to provide some links to these existing centers of excellence. And then, as I mentioned, the Capacity Building and Transformative Technology Committee to make sure that there's this continued guidance and ownership of that part of the treaty and that it delivers on its promise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for such a riveting presentation filled with so much great information in it. We do have a question for the panel, and I'm going to ask Professor Gobin to take this question, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, Professor Gobin. Someone asks, who do you think, I noticed that some Caribbean countries have not even signed the BBNJ, example, Trinidad and Guyana. For those who were involved in the process, what may have held them back? Professor Gobin, would you be able to share any insight into that question?
So I'm going to say that it's a very good question, and I've actually been asking it myself. I am going to go out on a limb here. Trinidad and Tobago, like Guyana, we are in a very special position with an oil-based economy, oil and gas exploration. And I think therein lies the conflict. And I mean, it's not news to the region that is going to be a conflict, because we are talking about environmental impact assessments. We're talking about marine protected areas. The Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana are going to have to make some serious determinations about what the sustainable practice is going to be. And I think that's where the problem lies, in that there perhaps the legal people are working on all of these things to ensure that the commitments we make as governments, as countries, that we would be able to adhere to them. Because once we sign onto that dotted line and we ratify, we are going to have to ensure that we put provisions in place, including legislation. So I think we might have some other legal people on the call who maybe have other ideas.
Thank you very much, Professor Gobin. Appreciate it. Rebecca, who is a director at the High Seas Alliance, might also have some insight into this. Rebecca, would you like to share any perspectives that you may have?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think that Professor Gobin definitely highlights a couple of the sensitive issues which may be considered by countries, but there's also some of those broader, there's a couple of other issues. One of them we talked about, it's been talked about extensively, is capacity. So obviously, even many countries are actually considering signing and ratifying at the same time. So, or they're trying to decide, do we have the capacity to implement the treaty? And they want to be sure about that before they commit. Because even signing actually is an indication that a country intends to ratify and implement. And some countries take that more seriously than others. Some are happy just to sign up straight away, even without assessing their capacity. So there's a capacity issue there. And then I think as well, which is interesting, there can be some geopolitical issues where some countries are waiting for more developed and richer countries to ratify to show that they really have buy-in to the treaty and that they're going to contribute, which is a really reasonable approach, I think, and also one of the key reasons why the High Seas Alliance is both, trying to support countries in the Global South with building capacity and being able to ratify and being prepared to implement, but also really working heavily on encouraging countries in the Global North to put their money where the mouth is and to step up and ratify quickly as well. So there are a couple of other options. I think there's quite a few reasons, and it can be pretty complex.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to emphasize that it is actually really, this is a reason why it's really important for civil society organizations to really communicate to their governments that they really, do want them to take it seriously and ratify as soon as possible.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Rebecca. I am going to allow Professor Berry to come in if he wants to, because he makes an interesting point in the chat. So Professor Berry, if you want to expand a little bit on it, because you make the point that some countries are actually trying to tweak their legislations before ratifying. So Professor Berry, I'll give you the opportunity if you want to come in very quickly.
I'll come in quickly. I think Judy has done a very diplomatic job, and Judy would know that I'm not very diplomatic. And so I won't shoot anyone for what's going on now. But there are countries who, in good faith, are trying to make the legislative changes that have signed before ratifying. Now, I have advised those countries, and as I said, I'm not necessarily very diplomatic. I've been quite blunt. I've said, that's fine, start the legislative changes, but ratify, because we want you at the first COP to take the Caribbean position forward. But I think Judy has outlined the reasons for those two states not going further more quickly. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Professor Berry.
Ryan, that if I could just add quickly,
Sure,
it's
Professor
so
Goodwin.
important that we get to the first COP. And given the timeline, we can't be waiting for these changes. We really need to get there. So we need to sign on.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Professors Berry as well as Professor Gobin. We're going to move into our final workshop session now, which will be dealing with empowering youth and indigenous communities in ocean governance. And for that, we'll have two journalists from the Caribbean region, one from Suriname, one from Jamaica. Stephanie Launchman is a climate and environmental journalist from Suriname, as well as Emma Lewis, who is from Jamaica, who is an environmental journalist. Stephanie, we'll start with you. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so happy to have been a part of this conference. I only have 10 minutes, so I want it to be interactive as possible. I'm not going to speak too much, but I'd rather hear your experiences. So, but one thing I do want to say when it comes to the word meaningful participation of indigenous peoples, something that's really important to me. And I also work with an indigenous organization. I work very closely with indigenous peoples, and something that's really important to us is that it's not a form of tokenism. So oftentimes when you're in these spaces, you have the token indigenous person so that the organization that is organizing, whether it's a conference or whatever, can check off the box that they have an indigenous person present. But is it meaningful? Because you can give me a stage to use my voice and to speak from my perspective and as an indigenous person. But if you're not listening to me, it's not meaningful participation. So we really have to do away with tokenism. And I also want to touch upon the importance of direct funding when it comes to participation of indigenous peoples. Oftentimes you have these organizations that are doing projects or whatever, also related to ocean governance, and but the funding is not going directly to indigenous peoples. So when it comes to indigenous stewardship of land and ocean, we know that indigenous peoples have a millennia-old relationship with the environment, including marine ecosystems. And indigenous peoples also almost always see the natural world as a sacred place, and also the ecosystem as sacred. So when it comes to global recognition of Indigenous knowledge. And we also look at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It acknowledges that Indigenous peoples have a unique relationship and they have a unique environmental stewardship. And it was also mentioned the different conservation goals, such as protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030. But also when it comes to goals like that, environmental Indigenous stewardship is really important. So looking at the role of Indigenous peoples in ocean governance, we know that Indigenous peoples and ocean governance, it offers valuable solution for sustainable management. So I'm really excited to hear in the chat. I don't know if we have Indigenous people still present in the chat, but if you're Indigenous or have worked with Indigenous peoples, I would love to hear from you kind of what your experience is when it comes to meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in these spaces. So Ryan, if you can help me out with the chat, maybe. I hope you guys are,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely. So what? Yeah. So what I would do is, yeah, I'll once I get something, I'll just interject and I'll let you know what somebody is saying. You can go ahead with your presentation in the meantime. As soon as I get some comments, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. So there are a few questions that I've posed, and I really want to build the conversations around these questions. So one of the first questions would be, what challenges do youth, Indigenous youth, should be Indigenous youth face in becoming leaders in the space, in the ocean governance space? So I'm not sure if anybody would like to interject on that.
Yeah, if anybody has a comment on that question or an answer on that question, you can drop it in the chat between me or Stephanie. We'll read it out. If you have an answer to that comment, to that question rather, that Stephanie has posed, please feel free to drop it in the chat. We do have Stacy saying it's an issue of the issue is a lack of trust of the government. She's from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a community called Garifuna. And she's saying, Stacy is saying that it's an issue of a lack of trust of the government, Stephanie.
I absolutely understand. And that's such an amazing point. And it makes totally sense that there is a lack of trust because if you look at the history, there has been the fact that Indigenous peoples historically have faced exclusion when it comes to policy making and governance framework and decision-making processes. So this goes really back to what I mentioned in the beginning of tokenism and meaningful participation versus just participation. Indigenous peoples are repeatedly being excluded. And when they do get a seat at the table, it's just so that someone can check out the box and say, I had an Indigenous person. But oftentimes there's no cultural sensitivity to including Indigenous peoples. We know that Indigenous peoples have different customs and different traditions. And something very important to note is the fact that we also have FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent. And when it comes to, at least in my experience, I would love to hear your experience as well. In my experience, especially in the context of Suriname, what I'm seeing is that FPIC is oftentimes not utilized when it comes to involving Indigenous communities in these decision-making processes. Is there any other comment in the chat?
Yeah, I was just actually trying to unmute for a little bit. Emma says, I firmly believe that both Indigenous and youth participation are sidelined and sometimes almost non-existent. It's important for youth to be fully integrated in every discussion and have a seat at the table, Stephanie.
Yes, no, I totally agree with that. But for me, it's more than having a seat at the table. And I'll circle back to this because it's really important to me. People shouldn't just have a seat at the table, but when they use their voice and give their point of view, especially when it comes to Indigenous and youth, their opinion and their valuable insights should not be left at the table. And that's what I'm seeing a lot, not only in Suriname, but really across the region, is that we have a seat at the table. There's always that one token indigenous person who's going to be in that space, but it's just so they can check a box. So it's more than just having a seat at the table, but you also have to respect the injection that you're getting from the indigenous communities. And you also have to have people who are culturally sensitive when it comes to these matters.
Stephanie, we have another one. Kalinago from Dominica. All right, this is Gary Orgis, by the way. There is also a lack of trust between the Kalinago Council and the government, especially in terms of using grant funds. There is a lot of praise or recognition in our political leaders' speeches, but we do not feel the direct support, says Gary Orgis. I'm also going to just read Danilyn very quickly. She says, indigenous knowledge should be led by indigenous people. Allowing people to lead with local knowledge should be a priority. I say this because of first-hand interviews with Garifuna in Belize and Kalina in Suriname, indigenous groups, that consultations, decision-making processes exclude them. Stephanie, two very interesting comments.
Yes, definitely. The first part, I think, mentioned funding, right? I said this at the start, and I really wanted to touch upon this because I feel like it's not spoken about enough. And it's the fact that there is not enough direct funding. So what we're seeing, and I can speak to the context of Suriname, when it comes to indigenous participation and projects that involve indigenous peoples, there's no direct funding. There's funding that's coming from somewhere in the world, but it's going to organization, whether it's a conservation organization or whatever, and they are tasked with executing these projects within indigenous communities, within indigenous lands. Sometimes these organizations don't even use FPIC. They don't even consult the indigenous communities in the way that they should. And if they do consult the indigenous communities, it's more of a form of tokenism. But you don't have indigenous peoples being a part of the decision-making process in that specific project. So that's why direct funding that flows directly to these indigenous communities is so important. Because as the person said, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name, indigenous peoples should be the one who are speaking on indigenous ancestral knowledge. And what was the second comment about? If you can refresh my memory, please, Ryan.
Sure, no problem. I'll tell you what Danilyn said. Indigenous knowledge should be led by indigenous people. Allowing people to lead with local knowledge should be a priority. She says this because of first-hand interviews she's done in Belize and Suriname with indigenous groups, that consultations, decision-making processes often exclude them, not include them.
Yes, definitely. So it's basically what I also just mentioned. I have nothing to add to that. I completely agree with that statement. Indigenous people should be the ones leading indigenous ancestral knowledge. And to do so, they need to be empowered. They need to not only get a seat at the table, but they also need to be heard and listened to. And their opinions and their valuable insights should also be used in those decision-making processes. Yes.
Just want to jump in really quickly, Stephanie, one quick time again for you, because Emma says governments are paying lip service to these groups, she suspects. Diana says we need to get funding for training communities, especially the youth, to play a leadership role. Peter says, accept all the things being said regarding indigenous people. How do we engage the youth of any or all peoples? That's a key question that he would like you to answer. Professor Berry says funding and engagement need to be accompanied by an understanding of the value of indigenous knowledge and perspectives. So a few interesting comments there for you, Stephanie, as we head towards the end of your presentation.
Yeah, so there was actually a question about, if I'm not mistaken, involving youth as a whole, engaging. So my colleague Emma Lewis is actually going to dive deeper into that. And since my time is up, I would like to also pass it to Emma so she can have the stage. Thank you so much. But I'll be happy to engage with the rest in the chat. Yes.
Such a wonderful presentation, Stephanie. Thank you very much for putting that together. Such insightful questions, and you really got some really insightful answers as well, if not very, very straightforward answers. Like Stephanie said, we have a final presentation from Emma. Emma, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sort of piggybacking on what both Dana Lynn and Stephanie said very quickly, and they sort of inspired me. But on a different note, I was thinking of ways in which we could really, in a meaningful way, engage young people. I'd like to ask the audience what they think is the main challenge facing, if you were talking about the issue of the high seas, what would be the main challenge from a youth perspective? How would they look at it? What would they say about it if you gave them, if you told them what the high seas is, what it is, what would their response be? What would their priority be? And also what they would like their country to take action on under the BBNJ Treaty, and how that can be incorporated in youth outreach. But maybe you could just, have some thoughts on that. But I want to go back and just sort of clarify. There's something that always sort of bugs me, is that youth, quote unquote, is a very broad description. And it may mean different things to different people. But what I would personally like to see in environmental education in general is much younger youth involved. We think of sort of 15 to 25-year-olds, something like that. I'm thinking 6-year-olds upwards. I mean, that might sound a little ridiculous. How could they understand, the high seas and so on? But to get them tuned in to the conversation, to get them tuned in to the issues. They love the ocean. They love going to the seaside. And what are their thoughts about what their priorities are, what they think are very important for them? Because a 6-year-old's pretty much probably well tuned in with some of them have smartphones and they watch a lot of programs. They're tuned in to information, and I think they will have thoughts for sure, and that we should also listen to them. So it's not just an 18-year-old high school student, but a 5 or 6-year-old primary school student up to about 10 years old. That's when they're gathering knowledge and using it during those years. So I think it's very important to include them. And as Stephanie already said, it's more than a seat at the table. She's quite right. There needs to be the views of youth in general need to be really taken on board and included in decisions. It's not just, as she said, checking the box, checking the youth box or checking the indigenous people's box. It needs to be included in decisions, in documents, and not separated out. I find what happens even with CARICOM and other governments is they say, oh, yes, let's have a youth event, and that's great, and there's lots of PR and social media and so on. But the youth are it's valuable in a sense. They're talking to each other, they're talking to their peers, they're getting ideas and so on. But how about more intergenerational interactions where they talk with older people, even people as old as me, but and share ideas, share thoughts. I also thought in terms of audience, we have to think about groups who already love the ocean, young youth groups. For example, we have lots of surfers in Jamaica. We have a diving community, mostly young people in both cases. The surfers are like teenagers. And talk to them and get them to promote the BBNJ and talk about it from their perspective. They're very close to the sea. They see and observe things that we wouldn't even know about. I have a contact who's a diver, and I'm just amazed at the videos she posts. You learn from them. Other ways we could engage youth would be, youth love to have competitions. So that's very important. I think our ECHO people, our ECHO youth ambassadors, the EarthEcho people, mentioned competitions. What works well in Jamaica is poetry. Everyone loves poetry. Performance poetry, art installations, mini videos, like, very short on YouTube, the shorts, skits and theatre. They don't have to be anything fancy or elaborate, but just to get the messages across. So this is fits in with Dana Lynn's concept of outreach, I think. And it's very important to really be truly inclusive within that youth group and within that Indigenous group. What about youth with disabilities? What about Indigenous groups who are unemployed, marginalized, and they're not engaged in any formal studies? We must include them in our programs and outreach. And rural and urban youth, they may have different issues, but they should all be engaged. And I think community interactions, I think teaching your peers is a good idea. And if you can train one or two youth leaders to just learn the basics and get them excited about the high seas and have them teaching their community, doing a little presentation, videos, and having a sort of rap session about it. And I also think, obviously, for youth, social media is very important. But don't just sort of leave it at that. I think it's important to have live discussions. I think the hands-on, the engagement, mentally and physically, is very important for young people. They want to be actually actively involved and not just sitting and listening. And that's why hands-on older youth can design their own projects, beach cleanups, underwater cleanups, active, fun, informative, to get all those messages across, field trips and boat tours. And I do think that social media can be overused, and sometimes you're preaching to the choir, or sometimes your response falls a bit flat. I think live discussions face-to-face still play a very important part. And encourage young people to be youth journalists. Climate Tracker Caribbean does a good job at that with their youth journalists. Encourage them to do on-the-ground interviews and to post on YouTube, their little short videos. Get creative. Yes, murals. I think someone mentioned murals earlier on. Gamification, anime, and music. Music is a wonderful, still for the Caribbean, it's a great channel for getting messages across. A few years ago in Jamaica, we had Voices for Climate Change, who were a group of sort of roots reggae, more or less, singers and performers. They had a fantastic response. So those are all my thoughts. I'm sorry I'm rattling through rather fast.
That's okay.
But two things sort of related tangentially to this discussion is there are actually 4 Caribbean countries that have ratified the BBNJ, because one of them is not a Commonwealth country. Do you know which one that is? Not a Commonwealth. 3 Commonwealth plus 1 outside the Commonwealth. Does anyone know what it is? If you know, you can put it in the chat. And that's about it, really. I'd like to know what people think about priorities for youth, what issue should they focus on first? It's a very complex issue. Should they focus on a particular fish that they would like to fishing might be one issue, and the illegal and unregulated fishing. What would be the focus for youth groups? So that's really my thoughts, and nobody's thought about which other Caribbean country has ratified the treaty. They don't speak English.
You may have to give us the answer.
Okay,
Cuba.
Cuba. Cuba, that's right. That's right.
Cuba, Barbados.
Yes,
and
that's right. Yes, Cuba. Let's go through it again now. Cuba, Barbados, Belize, and St. Lucia. Yeah. So that's about all I have to offer. I think a lot of what has been said, I'm just amplifying that a little bit, perhaps. But what I would also like to tell the youth is that they must get. I mean, this is just my emotional feeling is that young people must raise their voices. They should be, well, like the Swedish girl, the climate change girl, whose name escapes me. Talk up. Don't be afraid. I think young people are afraid of that they might upset someone in the government, so they're not going to say anything, or they're going to be very polite. Don't be too polite, please. And the same, of course, goes for Indigenous people. Talk to the adults in the room, demand attention, make sure that there is that follow-up that was spoken about, because it's your future. It's not, you're the young ones growing up. And I would really like to see more younger youth involved. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I must tell you, I've shared virtual platforms with you before, and your advocacy for youth, on behalf of youth, it's so commendable for someone really advocating for youth. And you continue to do extremely incredible job with the youth across the region, not only edifying them, because I've seen you in other circles edifying youth about writing on climate change, etc. So glad you could have joined us, Emma. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
What an afternoon we have had. It has been such an incredible afternoon talking about the High Seas Treaty. There are so many people who had to work so hard for such a long time to put together this conference. I see in the chat so many excellent presentations, excellent people, excellent panel, people saying how great Professor Berry was and Professor Gobin was and Khalil was from Trinidad. It took a really Herculean effort, and I'd like to welcome now to the virtual platform Lenica Scott, who will deliver for us the vote of thanks. Lenica.
Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure. To our meticulous moderator, Ryan, seasoned journalist and author, supported by Kemi, CEO of Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund, even though we didn't get to hear her voice today, Youth Ambassadors AJ and Sonia, Grenada's Special Envoy, Ambassador Jerry Eno, Khalil, Professor Berry, our workshop leaders, Dana Lynn, Ruth, Emma, Stephanie, our panelists, Professor Judith Govin, Nicola Clark, our High Seas Alliance team, Rebecca, Sarah, and Danielle, to our comms team led by the amazing Cami, on behalf of the High Seas Alliance and our partners, UNEP and EarthEcho International, I want to express our profound gratitude, our appreciation for your excellent delivery and value-packed presentations. Participants, we would not be here without you. We really wouldn't have been able to achieve today's objectives without your time commitment. And so we really want to thank you and express our appreciation for your support and your attendance. I want to encourage you to join the High Seas Alliance's network. If you check the chat, I know you'll be seeing quite a lot of information coming to you from our team. We have a lot of resources. We have toolkits if you want to join us on the journey to advocate for the ratification of the BBNJ within the region. So thank you so much to everyone.
You know, the one person Lenica didn't really thank was herself. Lenica, you worked so hard on this conference, and you know, Rebecca and Camilla and everybody else who you've been in touch with know that you worked so hard, especially in putting together this extremely incredible panel. You know, everybody just loved the panel so much. They agreed with what the panel was saying. They were experts in their fields and so many different fields. So Lenica, thank you very much for the incredibly hard work that you put into ensuring that this conference was a success. I know everything from the time to the running sheet and everything was all down to you. So we truly appreciate you. A real shining example of Jamaican and Caribbean youth excellence when it comes to high seas and climate change in the region. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Prof. Berry as well, and to Dr. Dane Bodo from the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. Even though he was unable to make it, he, you know, is severely unwell, but he was very supportive and supported the promotion of the conference.
Absolutely.
And Ryan,
thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Anytime and anything for Lenica, I always say. But thank you to everyone in the chat as well for your positive feedback and for being here. I know 3 hours can seem like a marathon, but we really do appreciate you guys for staying the course with us today to discuss what really is, as Professor Gobin put it, a very critical subject at a very critical time for the region. Knowing Lenica, it's not going to be the last, so look out. Follow the High Seas Treaty, follow the High Seas Alliance, follow the work that the Caribbean Regional BBNJ is doing in partnership with organizations like the UN Environment Program. There'll be a lot more opportunities for you to join, to be part of this movement, and ultimately head towards a treaty. On behalf of everyone involved in organizing this wonderful conference, we wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Have a good night.